listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And live from the divided states of America, it is time now for the show that brings you more sides of all the issues that really matter. In the independent corner, I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together, we make up the most disruptive show this side of the Milky Way galaxy. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to top headlines today. First up, DC's own football team, the Washington Redskins, will finally be changing its name today. This comes from Sports Business Journal, which first reported the announcement, plans later confirmed by the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Despite the announcement, the new name will not be revealed today because the team's preferred replacement is involved in a trademark dispute. In our second story, Epstein's longtime girlfriend and fellow alleged pedophile Ghislaine Maxwell is reportedly being moved from cell to lower the chances of an assassination. This comes as a rather fascinating event is occurring in the trial. Prong of her legal defense seems to hinge on the sweetheart deal Epstein got with Acosta. That deal found Epstein accepting 13 months in exchange for protecting any associates that were engaged in his salacious illegalities, some would say rape, of 30 children he was caught abusing, and asserting she was one of the associations. It asserts legal protections from prosecution afforded in the 2007 deal. In other words, she's potentially going to be protected by that earlier deal, although as we were talking about last week with Alexander Mercouris, there are some doubts about whether that'll actually hold up before the scrutiny of a court. In our next story today, President Trump has commuted Ryder Stone's sentence on 7 felony crimes on Friday. Former special counsel Robert Mueller criticized the decision, saying that Stone, quote, remains a convicted felon, and rightly so, end quote. We will be talking about this, as well as Ryder Stone's case, this commutation, all of it. We'll be talking about this later with Tyler P. Nixon at 8:30 a.m. Eastern today, so check back in for that. Trump has now, for the first time, worn a mask in public. This came during the pandemic, of course. This will be the first time during the pandemic. It was in a now highly publicized visit to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in suburban Washington to meet wounded service members and healthcare professionals caring for COVID-19 patients. But again, that is the first time he has been seen in public wearing a mask. And a lot has been made about that. We'll make more about that later, sure, too. Florida has seen a total of more than 15,000 new coronavirus cases in a single day as Disney World's parks began to reopen this Saturday. This comes as the state has seen 45 deaths in the last day. That seems to be this new developing epicenter. And again, this comes as Disney World, arguably one of the largest, if not the largest attractions in Florida, has reopened this weekend. So we'll see how that reopening goes as cases continue to spike there. In our next story, a federal appeals court has ruled that the first federal execution in 17 years may proceed as scheduled today. Family members and victims of Daniel Lewis Lee may take their case to the Supreme Court, as the family has mentioned it would not want to contract coronavirus while attending the execution. But again, that would be the first one in 17 years. Just interesting. It's been a long time. In Poland, Andrzej Duda has won a second term as the Polish president with a narrow 3% lead. This comes as Poland's governing right-wing Law and Justice Party, with which Duda is closely allied, will continue its controversial judicial reforms. The Navy has said that 21 people were injured in an explosion and fire on board a naval ship in San Diego. That ship now continues to burn. Firefighters are basically standing by and watching. Those 21 people included 17 members of the Navy, as well as 4 members of the general public. It's unclear what caused the explosion, but initial reports indicated overpressurization of the fuel compartment. The ship holds about a million gallons of fuel, so we can expect that to burn for a couple of days, they said. And in our last story, actor Johnny Depp will be giving his last comments in the Amber Heard libel trial today. That's taking place in the United Kingdom. After a series of high-profile spats over the details of their crumbling divorce, the latest news is that Heard or one of her associates may have defecated in Depp's bed, which he said was the last straw in their clearly failing relationship. You are all caught up. That is the news. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Oh, so Jamarl, with
Man.
that palate cleanser to clear your head, what is your top
I know,
priority for
right?
today?
You know when your life is going wrong, your life is not going on the right. Man, that's rough. That's hardcore. All right, fair enough. I guess what I'm going to talk about maybe is of more significance, if not necessarily, maybe not less, maybe slightly less interesting. That's astonishing. Um, so on Friday, the federal courts denied Roger Stone's emergency request for a postponement for his July 14th surrender date to a 40-month sentence of being convicted in November of lying to Congress, witness tampering, and obstructing a congressional committee's proceedings. And this, of course, refers to the Mueller investigation. Now, after the federal court rejected Stone's request, Donald Trump intervened using his presidential powers to commute Roger Stone's sentence, making him a free man. Now, this is not a pardon, this is a commutation. Stone is basically let out with the acknowledgement that he is, in fact, guilty. Now, liberals and Democrats were up in arms over this. We must impeach the president, screamed on Twitter. Impeach the president for a power that is well established to be within his purview to dispose of as he sees fit. Whether you like it or not is irrelevant to the fact that that's true. For once, just once, I would love to wake up to something that Donald Trump has done that is perfectly legal, that Democrats aren't calling for impeachment hearings. That's not to say that Roger Stone is a cuddly or in any way redeemable figure. Roger Stone is a crony in the fullest spirit of the word crony, a henchman in the fullest embodiment of the word henchman. More importantly, in this misbegotten plea for relevance, Stone lied himself into crimes to which he was duly convicted of. That said, let's be honest. Let's be very honest. CIA Director John Brennan lied to Congress about spying on the congressional body that was there to oversee that exact same CIA. DNI Director James Clapper sat before Congress and let out a whopper of a lie when asked if he knew anything about illegal mass surveillance. Now, of the three people that lied, despite the latter two being dramatically more consequential and, let's be honest, outrageous, they descended onto the third, meaning Roger Stone's house, as if it was a compound, as if this geriatric was going to come out guns a-blazing. And to add an extra bit of spice to this, cameras were out there at 5 in the morning. Now, who told the cameras? Who told the camera people? Who told the news people that, hey, make sure you're out there. Make sure your camera is pointed there. Make sure your light is pointed there. We want to get his face for a perp walk. We want to get him for a perp walk. We want to get him on television. Who did that? And why was that extra level of spite added to that? I am not a big fan of having our investigative mechanisms in regards to this government to be used for political ends. And that is exactly what was taking place. Otherwise, that scene didn't happen. As for the other two liars, you can see them on MSNBC and CNN pontificating all day, getting paid tons of money to do so. It is weird the way we allow some liars and not others, and the way that certain people are connected in a way that regardless of the fact that they could get there and lie on something that is monstrously inconsequential, there are monstrously no negative outcomes in their cases for that lie. But Stone, yeah, you want to crucify Stone. I'll put it this way. Given what avails us as a country, as a world for that matter, but more specifically as a country, and even having to reconcile the notion that there may be a Joe Biden presidency, there is nothing in me that this perfectly legal act, whether dubious or not, drills up in me to make me care about this. Nothing at all. I don't care. Now, what did trigger my annoyance was the response to this. Democrats are finding a camera to look into and basically lie. For example, lying Adam Schiff, who does his name great, Shifty, continues to kick the dead Russiagate horse. And in kicking that dead Russiagate horse, sat down with Stephanopoulos and made contradictory statements that didn't make sense in the least. And yet, Stephanopoulos sat there, listened, and basically went on to the next question without saying, wait a minute, that didn't make sense. Let's hear the clip. Let's play the clip.
Stone was convicted in part for false statements he made to your committee. What's your response to the president?
I think anyone who cares about the rule of law in this country is nauseated by the fact that the president has commuted the sentence of someone who willfully lied to Congress, covered up for the president, intimidated witnesses, obstructed the investigation. It shouldn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican. This should be offensive to you if you care about the rule of law and you care about justice. Let's remember, George, that Roger Stone was the intermediary. He was the link between Donald Trump and the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence, the same Russian intelligence unit that hacked Donald Trump's opponents' emails. He was the link with their cutout, WikiLeaks, as well, through which they published these. And Donald Trump was desperate to get his hands on these emails. He urged the Russians to hack Hillary's emails. He touted them when they did, over 100 times on the campaign trail. He thought they were central to his victory. And this effort to get and use foreign assistance is what Roger Stone had information on. And he lied to cover up and protect the president. And the president, through this commutation, is basically saying, if you lie for me, if you cover up for me, if you have my back, then I will make sure that you get a get-out-of-jail-free card.
I greatly dislike Schiff. Just so we're clear, Roger Stone claimed to be an intermediary between Donald Trump and WikiLeaks. Roger Stone was convicted. Convicted. The book was thrown at him because he lied about that. He wasn't a backdoor to anything. Roger Stone turned around and threatened Randy Credico to try to follow through with that lie. When Credico refused to do so, Roger Stone threatened Credico and his dog. Now, just so we're clear, Stone was convicted, not NOT, for being a backdoor to Russia. That was the lying charge. The threat was against Credico for the secondary charge of interference and, again, threatening him and his dog. The conviction of Stone is another plank in the rotted bridge of Trump and Russia going up in smoke. And just to make this point that much more plain, the Washington Post has already discussed this in detail that made it very clear. So Washington Post, as it goes between us, in fact, Mr. Stone, a former campaign advisor, had no real ties to WikiLeaks. Another part. Credico flatly rejected another claim that Stone made to Congress that Credico and his secret intermediary to WikiLeaks and Assange. He conceded and promised to reach out to WikiLeaks on Stone's behalf, but testified he never did. Credico readily admitted there were exaggerations, there were lies, there were rebuffs. Yes. On cross-examination by Stone's lawyer, Robert Bushell, Bannon conceded that Stone never claimed he had any advanced access to hacked emails. He was a con man. He was a con man, and he got convicted for being so. Does Stephanopoulos not know the subject matter to which he's engaging? What is it, George? Are you just blessed with that newsman face, but you have basically people writing your script, so you just read it as you go to the next question? He sat there and lied. He sat there and lied in a way that was utterly and entirely contradictory. And you sat there and listened to him and just moved on to the next, as if his misdirections and basically vague statements in order to confuse the audience who may not necessarily have been paying attention, given the spirit of the Russiagate stuff. You just sat here and let him do that. What I care about, in real terms, what I care about is that all of these people are going to get thrown out of their homes. I care about the fact that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party is still not supporting Medicare for all. The painting stuff on the ground, or for that matter, the wringing of the hands about this, don't care one iota. Shane, the Democrats have been up in arms over this. And I've been watching them and thinking to myself, if I was president and I wanted to let go somebody named, Pookie Boo Boo Jenkins that I had as a friend in 8th grade, I could do that if I'm president. That's within my skill set. That's within my power. And the notion that you're going to come around and cry, as if should be changed somehow just because you don't like it is nonsense. It looks like you would have better things to do. And yet, here we are.
Sadly, here we are. Yeah, again, they're trying to extend the ghost, resurrect the ghost, if you can even resurrect a ghost of Russiagate. They're trying to play this out as much as they possibly can. I mean, we can come back to this, and we're going to have Tyler P. Nixon on at 8:30 to talk about Roger Stone. I think there are some things that a lot of people get wrong about this trial, about these charges, about what actually happened there. It has to do with Steve Bannon, even the Credico stuff with the dog. We can come back to that, but as far as I can tell, Roger Stone really likes animals. And then the thing with the dog was that Randy Credico, and again, we can talk with Tyler Nixon about this, had been mistreating his dog. And then it's not like he was threatening to kill the dog. It's like he was going to take it away so that Credico wouldn't mistreat it anymore. I know that gets in the weeds and it's all kind of silly, but to your point, it is silly. It was on the fringes. Again, he was a prominent scalp for them, but it's not like he was a core constituent, clearly, of any supposed Russiagate conspiracy, which again has been deflated time and again. Regardless, though, we'll talk about that on the other side as well as at 8:30. Until then, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. Quick little ad here. If you want to call in, you can. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, that's 202-521-1320. I will send out the info, though. I'll tell you where you can listen to us. If you're in D.C. and you want to catch us on the air, you can. 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you're in Kansas City or the Kansas City area, 102.9 FM, also 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. And then there's this whole cluster of websites and apps and stuff that you can access our show online. You can listen to us on Spreaker, Stitcher, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, now on Periscope too. So if you go over to Twitter, twitter.com/faultlinesradio, you can find our Periscope there. We're live now. Jamarl, you also have the Jamarl Thomas YouTube channel. So if folks go to YouTube and type in Jamarl Thomas, they should see you live right now, right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, we're taking calls this segment. So the number there is 202-521-1320. With Roger Stone, the one last thing, I was kind of defending him there with the Credico stuff, and we can get more on that later with Tyler Nixon. But also, I don't think he's described himself as a dirty trickster. I see him described as a self-described dirty trickster, which is a little bit, self-referential and tautological at a certain point. If you say that somebody else describes him a certain way and you say that enough, can you just say that? No, I don't think that would work. I think they actually have to say that about themselves. And as far as I can tell, he hasn't yet. Regardless, though, he's definitely a political operative. I've actually hung out with him one time, just the once.
Did you?
He was doing
no way.
With him. Yeah. No, we went up. It was in his hotel room, not too a block away from the K Street office. I forget the hotel, but pretty close by.
Uh-huh.
And they did an interview, and I was in the room, and he had those sartorial sensibilities. He was definitely well dressed, but interesting dude to hang out with, and interesting dude to see operating sort of in the sphere of the news. And as far as I can tell, you're talking about this. I don't think he did a lot of the things they're saying he did. I don't think he should have been charged with this stuff in the first place. I think this was political. But even if he did, the point is that kind of activity is so constant in Washington. And I don't think he did, so I'm not actually saying this exactly, but it's so constant. You're right. It's just obvious how politicized it was. It's obvious that this was just a cudgel in the sort of Russiagate narrative. Like I said before, it was like a scalp they were trying to get.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. I mean, look, whatever Roger Stone was, and let's say it's the worst. Let's say the worst thing that it was. You have Schiff, who's basically saying that Roger Stone was a plank and that he was convicted and he was the intermediary. But he's being so vague in the way that he's talking about those things. Those statements are contradictory. Stone, look, at whatever he was, if you say that he was a liar about it, you're basically saying that the Russiagate thing was nonsense because he was the link between those things. Now, at his wildest of guilt, he's basically guilty of lying. And, you know, it's not so much that I love this idea of people lying to Congress, but I am absolutely aware that the way they responded to him lying to Congress was dramatically different than they responded to other people lying to Congress. And if it just came across as spiteful and political. And I have serious qualms with that. If they can do that with Stone, they can do that with basically anybody. And the way that Brennan and Clapper were basically beyond reproach, where nobody would think of bringing charges against them for lying to Congress in such a brazen way, Stone wasn't that connected person. So he was fair game to just be taught a lesson for being in cahoots or being in association with Donald Trump. So, you know, it's not so much that I love Stone. It kind of goes beyond whatever Stone is. It goes into this notion of what do you want your political instrument to be? And do you want your investigative functions to be used in a way to punish and to basically make or, you know, settle political grievances? And my answer is no. You know, I'm definitely not a Republican, but I certainly don't want that to take place, regardless of what his political disposition is.
Yeah, no, it just seems like that's what's happened. I mean, again, you look at the SDNY, clearly politically controlled, clearly in the best interest of the establishment when a lot of the cases go through. And again, that's the district covering Manhattan. So just taking that as a sort of little litmus test of maybe some of the worst extents, maybe again high-profile extents, but the worst extents of the judicial system and how it handles things. You looked at the Browder case before. That kind of corruption, that kind of thing is rampant, and I don't know what you do about it. But you corrupt your whole system once you start to add more and more of the political bias as we've seen it being added over recent years. So that's a big problem.
You call
in
balls and
strikes.
strikes. I mean, but but see, it's not that difficult, right? This is one of those things. It's like in the old days, they would say, all right, we're now going to pass legislation that blacks and whites are integrated. And it's like, but wait a minute, we were integrated from the time we were brought over here. It's like, what are you guys talking about? Well, this is kind of one of those same things, right? It's simple. You look at a crime and you prosecute it. And you look at a crime on the other side and you prosecute it. And your reaction to it, it's not something that is based on political bias. Meaning, if Wall Street crashes the economy, you prosecute Wall Street. You don't have anything involved in regards to your political allegiances because of the amount of money that you were able to get from that organization. If George Bush gets involved in a war that gets 1 million people killed and 4,000 Americans killed, then you prosecute it. If it looks like George Bush lied, or for that matter, George Bush was engaged in torture and tortures against our laws. It's just prosecuting and doing the job of the investigative functions.
We can come back to this stuff. Totally. Oh yeah, totally. We can come back to this. We have Tarif on the line. Tarif from New Orleans, you're on the line. What is on your mind?
A lot on my mind. A lot. Dealing with what's going on in the world. Okay. Good morning, gentlemen. I have 3 comments before I go into the comments. AT&T supposed to upgrade our phone service today. I hope we don't have no backdoor to the service where it interferes with my internet or the phone calls I'll be calling y'all any other time. Okay, Ghislaine Maxwell had a nephew that was working with the Hillary Clinton from 2009 to 2012 at the State Department, and he's worked on the Libya conference and also the Syria conference dealing with the Friends of Syria and the Friends of Libya. He worked on different things dealing with Iran and Israel and North Africa and the Middle East. And it's kind of funny, that this dude worked, and his other name was Isabel Maxwell. I'll put the link up underneath y'all link tweet for today. Also, the Friday had the U.S. government filed a superseding indictment against Ghislaine Maxwell Friday. I don't know what that means, but I put that link underneath the tweet for today for y'all. And my last comment is my opinion dealing with Ghislaine Maxwell being moved around. It's easily that they're afraid. I mean, I know they're afraid that something might happen to her. The best thing they can do, take her out that prison, put her on a military Air Force base like in South Dakota or North Dakota where Shane Daddy at, and put her out there and put guards around her with a blackout fence around her at one of those old colonel homes, right? Put in one of those old colonel homes or general homes, and and make sure that her health is good and everything, because she's a witness now. Okay, just remove her from everybody, put her on a military base. That's the way you deal with that. That's all I wanted to say this morning.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you, man. Thank you for sending that stuff over. I actually got the heads up. I saw you posting that earlier. Whitney Webb has been talking about that, and I still need to look into it more. With again, Ghislaine Maxwell's nephew apparently being in the State Department. And need to look into that more. But thank you for sharing that. And then that last thing, I just my quick comment. I mean, basically, the idea there is isolate her as much as you possibly can. You said North Dakota, South Dakota. I don't know. Is there some remote Peloponnesian island or something that we technically have access to that maybe we can just send her out there on a raft? Adrift? No, I'm just kidding. That wouldn't be.
What's funny though, the moment that you're moving her around that way, it almost doesn't it not to some degree give credence to the notion that she could be assassinated? Like, isn't that bizarre? Like, yeah. I mean, but it's accepted so casually. Like, yeah, we're gonna move her around to avoid somebody whacking her. It's like, wait, somebody's trying to whack her? Do you think somebody whacked Epstein? Whoa, we're not trying to go there. We're just trying to go there. We're just trying to like just. Well, I mean, the operative question. Who do you think is trying to whack her if you are indeed moving her around in that way? Like, that's fascinating.
It's all silly. I don't understand the world we live in, man. It does not make any sense. It really doesn't. Like, everything's sort of weirdly ironic and inverted in exactly the way that you're bringing up there. I don't know if you know what I mean, but like it's exactly what you're saying. Everybody knows that's the case. And it's rational. Exactly. They're doing it for exactly that reason. But as far as I can tell, like, nobody's putting two and two together in the public media, in the establishment media. Right. That
nobody says
the fact that
nobody
we're
says
worried
that.
About it. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like we're concerned about her being whacked. It's like because if you say we're going to put her in paper clothes because we don't want her to off herself. Okay, fair enough. That's a self thing. And then people are saying, we're going to take precautions because of what Epstein did. Fair enough. If you say we're going to shuffle her from cell to cell, it's like, well, why are you doing that? Well, we want to make sure that there are no, attempts on her life. Yeah, but who do you think is making an attempt on her life? That just seems to be the most natural question in the world. I do think our world is rational, unfortunately, but it's rational to a certain point of view of, get what you have to get out of this process. And I do think our society has blind spots. This is kind of one of those things where it doesn't necessarily want to, I guess, even approach. And because it doesn't want to approach, it doesn't just kind of overtly say, why are you moving her from place to place like this? And if you do indeed believe that there's a chance that somebody could try to take her life, who do you think is going to do that? Do you think that's because of her connections to powerful people? Do you think that's because it's concerns that she may talk? Like, what do you think? What's the thing that's causing you to do that? I don't know if anybody has asked those questions, if I'm being entirely honest, at least not that I've seen. But I get what you mean when you say it's odd and oddly ironic, because you're right. Stuff like that can happen, and the media never just kind of asks the most basic of questions. It's kind of skated across without connecting the dots in a kind of real, tangible way. Yeah, I agree with you, Shane.
Yeah. And I mean, again, you were talking about the judiciary and like corruption of the judiciary earlier. This ties into the media too in a weird way. It's like all of these are institutions for deliberating on truth and creating representations of the truth for somebody's consumption, whether it's the public or some other legal official or whatever. But usually, a lot of this stuff breaks through into the public sphere too. So a lot of the time, it's processing information, dealing with it in some way, in different ways, obviously, in the media and the judiciary, but it's the same process. And then you give it to the public. The problem with that is that if you want to politically manage that process, you just are going to selectively distort the public's perception of what's going on over time. And I think that's where we are. The reason that things are ironic and weird and all twisted like this is we're used to living in a society where for decades, from every sphere, basically, things have been distorted and changed to try to manipulate your opinions. We were talking about blind spots. What if our society is held together by its blind spots? And what the heck does that even mean? I mean, I can tell you more. And there's some stuff that you just by definition wouldn't be able to see. But the things that I can see are kind of frightening. The idea that, again, for instance, just a simple belief, if we're going to act as if our government is competent or can accomplish some of the fundamental things that we want it to, we're kind of having to delude ourselves, because in a lot of cases, when you look at the major crises that we've had to deal with, the one that we're dealing with now, for instance, hasn't happened. But the society itself is predicated on this idea that the government can accomplish what it needs to. I would say that's the biggest one. But anyway, you didn't mean to go off into too much of a tangent there. We're going to be joined by Rick Sanchez on the other side of this break. And I suppose I'll take us out. We can get into that conversation. Be back in just a minute with Rick Sanchez. Should be a very interesting conversation. TV presenter on RT America, specifically for his nightly news show, News with Rick Sanchez. We'll be back with Rick in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Yo, Sjursen, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from our station in D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you are consuming us on, give us a like, share the content. You can get involved in the conversation, either with a tweet, a chat, or for that matter, you can give us a call at 202-521-1320. But right now we are joined, internationally recognized award-winning broadcast journalist, reporter, news presenter, and host of the nightly news show News with Rick Sanchez on RT America. We are joined by Rick Sanchez. Rick, welcome to the show.
I kind of like the way you phrased that a little while ago. That nomenclature was pretty darn good. That if you're digging what we're putting down, I'm going to have to steal that. I do promise to give you credit for it.
Oh, we're going to get attribution. Very nice. No, you know what? You believe it or not, I am so happy that you're on the show. You're one of my favorite presenters on RT. In fact, you're the one that got me watching the network. I found myself night after night ending up on your channel watching your content because I really like your point of view and the way you look at the stuff. So I want to go into Democrat hypocrisy. Now, they have cried after letting Stone go with commuting the sentence that there are two tiers of justice. There are two tiers of justice. And they've made this argument that Trump, in doing this, is basically showing that there's no such thing as justice in America anymore. And somebody kind of made the point like, well, wait a minute, look at all the issues associated with Joe Biden. And going beyond the issues of Biden and his family, you get into the Iraq War, where they didn't necessarily prosecute something that even Nancy Pelosi said she knew was a fraud. You get into the lying about the Syria conflict, where Trump will come out openly say the previous president invaded a country for the sake of trying to overthrow that country and got 500,000 people killed, but we're going to keep the oil while we're there and we're going to destroy the wheat crops. Like, it's a weird way in which our country sees these things. Now, you're in the media, and I often ask the question, are they incompetent or are they lying? What is it? How is this stuff completely ignored in this way? Is it groupthink? Is it just these stories are de-incentivized, or the point of view is disincentivized in some kind of way? You've been behind the scenes. What goes on?
Well, I think we need to, first of all, separate this notion of Biden versus Trump. So I think the fairest way to do that is to essentially deal with what we actually have. And while everything that you just said is true from an institutional standpoint, and by the way, everything you just said about Biden in terms of tying him, and I can go beyond that, by the way, you tied him to the horrors and atrocities that we committed in Iraq. We could add to that what's going on right now in Bolivia. We can add to that what happened under Hillary Clinton in places like Honduras. We could go on describing all the things that our government has done in our name that are just shameful and wrong. And as you said, the media will never point them out. And most of the people who have condoned that have had R's in front of their names and D's in front of their names. The R's probably from a standpoint of the worst case scenario are more to blame, I suppose, because they're the ones who fashioned, lied about, and created the entire Iraq war, which is probably one of the most shameful lies in the history of our country. I would argue, of course, that the Democrats went along with it as soon as they were told that it was uncool not to go along with it and that they could possibly get voted out, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, from an institutional standpoint, we're talking comparing Dems to ours. And if you're going to make the point that how can they be against this guy when they're for this, you're absolutely right. Here's the difference as I see it. Donald Trump is a vile, vindictive, horrible human being in every sense of the word, from what I am able to tell, who has used his daddy's $400 million that he left him to lie, cheat, be corrupt, and steal on a personal basis before he even became a politician. Has he changed anything that the Dems were doing wrong? Really not. He's talked about it. And I guess we give him kudos for not getting us in a new war. But has he made me feel safer? Like, oh, because of him, we're probably never going to have another war in this in my lifetime? No. As a matter of fact, he kind of, for a long time, has let Pompeo kind of run roughshod over things that we all know don't even make sense. So in that sense, I guess if you're trying to say Biden is just as bad, I don't think so. I don't think Biden is just as bad, at least from a humane or human standpoint. I think he's dumb. I don't see any intellectual weight there. I think he's a little slow and may have some cognitive issues. He doesn't scare me from a human standpoint. But again, I'm left with, if I have to break this down for you, pardon me, I'd break it down this way. From an institutional standpoint, I don't see anything that the Dems will do that I think emboldens or creates a better America any more than if we were to elect a Republican. The only difference is I do think Trump is a little over the top from in terms of his personal characteristics. Let me just put it this way. I would never hire the man in my company, okay? In fact, I don't think he'd make it through the first interview.
Another thing, I probably wouldn't either. Another thing, and great to have you, Rick. This is Shane here. Thank you for joining us. Another thing, and you basically already said this, is that if you elect Trump, you're electing sort of Trump himself, with some establishment interface there. If you elect Biden, you're basically electing the Democratic Party. That's effectively the opinion set, the policy provisions, all this stuff that you're going to get from them.
Yes.
In other words,
and are you happy with that? And are you happy with that? Of course not. I mean, who would be? I mean, and here's the point that we were talking about earlier. Does the media focus on any of these things? Well, they tell you, because the media has this sense of creating everything as polar opposites, right? Trump good, Biden bad. I mean, or Trump bad, Biden good, depending on what channel you're watching at any time. And there's no nuance. There's no explanation of all the things that go into these decisions and what's actually happening. So, for example, we will get all the stories about Trump's problems, but, for example, Trump did not let us, the Ukraine story, for example, the impeachment, which was a perfect story. I mentioned this on the air last week. It made me crazy. What story was it what was the story that broke last week? Help me out here, guys. Where we were talking.
You mean the Russia bounty story?
United States Oh, yes.
Russian
the Russian
bounties?
Let's
Yeah.
take that story apart for, yes, thank you. Let's take that story apart for one moment, because here's what you have. You basically have an accusation that another nation interfered in the United States, and that what was the accusation? My God, isn't that funny?
Basically, that the Russians were playing the Taliban to kill American troops. And the question was like, well, why would the Taliban need money to do something that they've been doing perfectly fine for the past 20 years?
The story's been shut down, and basically it's so incredibly thin. One wonders why they went for it, other than the fact that they wanted to make Trump look bad and tie him to Putin. That's obvious, right? But what we're left with at its core, from a rudimentary standpoint, is that another nation, in this case Russia, was using its influence, right, or its money to interfere in a war that would kill soldiers. Meanwhile, we all as a nation literally watched the impeachment of Donald Trump, where day in and day out we were told by the Democrats that Donald Trump was interfering in our right to use our money and our influence in Ukraine to kill Russians. Like, what kind of crazy parallel universe are we living in, where we don't even realize that our own country is telling us we have the right to use our money to kill Russian soldiers, and we're going to tell you this every day for 1 month on national television. And now we have what seems to me almost the audacity to come out and say, how dare they use their influence to possibly, maybe, unfortunately we don't have the evidence of it, but they may have tried to kill American soldiers with their money.
But see, that goes to the whole
craziness of the world we live in. We're not told those both stories. We're only told one. I'm sorry.
But that goes to the Syrian war also, though. I mean, like, if that's true, that means when the United States was basically assisting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to kind of drag Russians into a Vietnam war, well, that would mean that by definition, under this logic, we were basically paying them to kill Russians. Same thing with the Syrians. Same thing with the kill squads in South America. Like, I don't necessarily know if we get the logic of what we're saying with this. Let me ask you this. In your profession, when you were working at some of the other mainstream outlets, did they not get these stories? Did they not see this? Was this just not something that they prioritize in regards to discussing with Americans night after night?
Boy, where do I begin this story? I think I learned a lot when I went to write my book at CNN, and I started trying to detail some of the things that I wanted to talk about. For example, because I'm a Hispanic American, I'm keenly interested in some of the things that happen in Latin America. And our history in Latin America is just really, really ugly. Of course, nobody in our media, nobody anywhere knows anything about it because we just don't pay attention to it. We'd rather talk about, as you say, Syria and the Middle East. The things that are going on today that we just found out about in Bolivia, where we didn't like the fact that the president was elected by his own people. So we essentially sent in the CIA goons. This is happening now. This just happened a month ago. This is not 10 years ago. This is not the Mujahideen. So we just recently fomented a coup in a country because we didn't like the outcome of their election. So we took out Morales and we put in some crazy woman who apparently was trained here at American University in Washington, D.C. So she can do whatever the hell she wants to in America's interest. This is Bolivia. We did the same thing during the administration in Honduras. We took out Zelaya, who I've had on my show, and I've interviewed him several times. He says, all I wanted to do was give my people more stuff. They thought I was a lefty, so they got rid of me, and they put somebody else in there. We're trying to do, I mean, this goes on and on and on, and it's just really frustrating, both as a communicator, as a citizen of this world, that we allow these things to happen, and they go completely unreported. And when I tried to mention some of these things in my book, the ombudsman at CNN, who had to review my book before it was published, slashed all that material out and essentially said, no. We can't go there because, and I think their fear deep down has to do with the effect of Fox News. CNN used to cover those kinds of stories much more. Fox
Rick,
News
hold
came
on.
along.
Let us take a break real quick. Rick, let us take a quick break, and let's get back into the meat of this when we get back to the other side. We're here with Rick Sanchez, host of the Rick Sanchez Show on RT. We'll be back in a moment. This is Thomas and Stranahan. You're listening to Fault Lines.
Fault Lines. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we are
Welcome
back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined now by Rick Sanchez. Rick Sanchez is an internationally recognized award-winning broadcast journalist, reporter, news presenter, and he's the host of the nightly news show News with Rick Sanchez on RT America. Real quick note, if anybody wants to follow him on Twitter, you can just go to twitter.com/Rick Sanchez TV. That's RickSanchezTV, all one string like that. Rick, thank you again for joining us. I wanted to get back into this. Yeah, you were starting to say something very interesting there about the contrast between CNN, Fox News, how the ombudsman for CNN, when he stepped in to review your work, he started to slash some of this stuff. And you were, I think, about to draw a very interesting parallel between CNN and Fox News, how they saw themselves, how CNN saw Fox, and how that affected their coverage of important stories like the ones you were trying to get out there.
There's no question in my lifetime, and by the way, I have the unique perspective of having worked local, Univision, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, Fox News, and now RT. So I've worked at all of them. I've seen them all from the inside out. And I happened to be at NBC at the time that Fox News and the Iraq War was going on. I remember they had just hired two young buck correspondents. One was Rick Sanchez, and the other was Lester Holt. And we, because we were hired together, used to spend a lot of time chatting and talking about what was going on. As we started getting into the Iraq War, Lester and I would go into a corner of the newsroom and chat. And I remember the conversations were something about, this is crazy. Why the hell are we going to war with these people? This doesn't add up. The evidence doesn't make sense. We shouldn't be doing this. And I remember we were having these conversations and thought about bringing them out on the air. And we kind of attempted to, but the pressure to not say that on television was so great. And the reason was Fox News had gone into an all-out cheerleading mode about everything that America did militarily was right because we were America and we were strong and the rest of the world could, you know what, because they're weak anyway. So anybody who came out against, even question the Iraq War, was immediately destroyed by Fox News. And anytime any one of our anchors, including Phil Donahue, would go on TV and question it, the ratings went down, the Fox News attack machine went into full gear, and that took place at MSNBC. The same thing was taking place at CNN. So when you ask me sometimes why all networks today, it goes beyond that, by the way, because now there's a corporate influence in some of what happens in boards and how many people from the industrial military complex actually have seats in media companies, which has taken it to a new realm. But at the beginning, if you were to ask me, what got CNN and all the other media to stop covering the truth about some of the things that were perhaps wrong that were being done in our name by our country or our military or our weapons manufacturers, it's that they were afraid of being called weak, of being called lefties, of being called whatever the hell you're going to call them, and that they would lose ratings, lose shares, and lose audience. And that's why that first precipitated.
Wow.
So it worked.
That's
Roger Ailes essentially was brilliant in his ability to manifest that sense that we're the only real America here. So we couldn't criticize Israel, because if you criticize Israel, Fox News would call you anti-Israel, which means you're anti-American. You couldn't criticize what America would do in Latin America. You couldn't criticize what America did in Syria. You couldn't criticize any of this stuff, and that was just the beginning of it. Since then, it's gotten worse, by the way. And let me just say again, because of the interlocking that's taken place in America's corporate boards at the level of companies that make sure their bread is buttered and their investment in these companies is going to be whole.
But see, this gets to the whole idea of monetized reality, right? I mean, isn't there a responsibility on some level, even, this may be a schoolboy philosophy of the higher purpose of news and the higher purpose of trying to get this kind of fourth or fifth estate. But isn't there somewhat of a philosophical responsibility to, regardless of other pressures, beyond those other pressures, to ensure that the public gets an understanding of what is taking place in their world? And without that understanding of what is taking place in the world, you basically have a Frankenstein monster regarding your government. I mean, that does seem to be what we have.
Yes, of course. Everything you just said is essentially the edict we all take when we go to journalism school. When I studied journalism at the University of Minnesota, under the auspices of Eric Severide and all the great masters who had been really good reporters. Of course, they all had their faults and all, there's no such thing as perfect journalism, but journalism that tries to be transparent, that tries to tackle society's woes, that tries to help the poor. Yes, that's the essence of journalism. But today, that independence is gone. You don't have one guy who grew up in, let's say, Kansas City, and he owns the local television station or the local newspaper. The local newspaper is owned as part of 150 other newspapers by some giant conglomerate who has a guy from Raytheon sitting on its board. So do you think they're going to tell you the truth about our wars? Get the hell out of here. That's gone, and I'm not sure it's coming back. So then there's the other element, at least at the network level. Those people who we watched, the Rachel Maddows of the world and the Tucker Carlsons of the world, all these actors, they're paid tens of millions of dollars. Do you think you are going to challenge tens of millions of dollars once you're used to spending it? What are you going to do with your Ferrari? What are you going to do with your $4 million house in the Hamptons or whatever the hell it is? If tomorrow you decide, you know what, I think I'm going to tell the truth today. You tell the truth, you could lose your job. You lose your job, you got to figure out what the hell to do with the Ferrari and the $4 million home. I mean, that's the reality. It used to be that journalists were paid just like regular people. And if you lost your job, you could probably go get another one. Today, they're exalted. They're on a plane that doesn't even compare to the rest of society. So hell no, they're not going to tell you the truth.
So how's the perspective set then? I mean, because whether we're talking about, I always make the point of saying, this is almost like state media of sorts. It's just state media by another name. And because it's by another name, it gets a certain level of credibility that it doesn't really deserve, especially when most of these things come across as if they're just being stenographers. So what sets the narrative? What sets the focal point in regards to what's discussed as opposed to what's not discussed?
Ratings. Yeah, it's still a ratings monster. You want to be able to create the greatest, coolest story and gather the most amount of heat for your story or from your story so that you can get people saying, ooh, wow, did you see that new thing Rachel Maddow found out last night about Trump? Or if you're Fox News and Tucker Carlson, ooh, did you see that new thing Tucker Carlson found out about black people? They all have their boogie people or Hispanics or immigrants. They all have their boogie monsters, and they attack them based on the need to get ratings within that subset. So they're doing news to a subset. They're not doing news because they're trying to tell you what's really interesting or what's going on in the world. And beyond that, you work there long enough, you kind of know where the box is, and you get to know the walls. So you know which come near, but not to cross it, whether you work in one place or another. And that's the case in all the corporate media holdings. So I can't tell you that there's a guidebook that they give you that says at MSNBC, you will never report on something that Trump did that's good, or at Fox, you will never say that immigrants are helping America in any way. But it just comes, there's no, they don't give you that rule book, but you just see it in the coverage. And I think when you work there, you kind of get the feeling that, ooh, I better stick to this narrative if I want to keep my job or get promoted.
It's that kind of subtle social pressure you're describing there. That's very interesting to hear. Actually, we only have a few minutes left, about 3-4 minutes left with you on the air. Thank you again for joining us. Quick question here. Going back over the history last week of journalism, we were talking with Margaret Kimberly. She was telling us again about the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I'm a pretty young guy. This is a little bit after I was born, but still before my time. I was going back and reading more about that. And again, you're talking about these mergers of these smaller newspapers, these smaller media entities into these larger conglomerates. I'm guessing, just tracing the history back, that was a pretty big event. And then it seems like after 9/11, again, I was maybe 9 years old at that time. I'm not trying to date myself too much, but I remember this change in the atmosphere. Everybody has their own memories of that moment in time, that moment in history. This change in the atmosphere of the media that I was a little bit too young to recognize possibly. But from that point on, as far as I can tell, the dynamic of the news, the way that the news operated, shifted. It shifted into a sort of 24-hour schedule, a rolling schedule. Yeah. What's your take on that transition? What am I leaving out there? But broadly, what's your take on what happened to corrupt the media, the professionals, the journalists?
What you're leaving out is this. Let me draw a picture for you that's incredibly scary. Because media has gotten cheap, and by that I mean you and I could probably get enough money together in a couple of days to buy a radio station today, right? You and I could probably put together a deal to buy a small television station. It's just not what it used to be. I mean, the entities have been selling fast, which means they're they're easier to buy, and the laws have been changed so you can own a crap load of them now. So here's the scary part of that. That means Jeff Bezos tomorrow could probably buy 75% of all the television stations in America and probably buy 2 of the 3 major networks, and then go on after owning his Washington paper to buy every newspaper in the United States. And one man with one opinion, or the hell of an opinion, one man with whatever his needs are, the story that he needs told to be able to sell more of whatever he wants to sell, would then dominate all the thought process in the United States. Think about that, because it's possible. It's almost possible already if you plug in how much money he has that he could spend on media. And by the way, for a lot of these guys, it's a write-off. If you have $50 billion, you could literally get mad at a newspaper and just buy them. I don't like the story they did. Okay, I now own the Dispatcher. I now own the Pioneer Press. I now own, and this is happening all over the place. So what we're getting is the message that some very powerful source wants us to hear, and it's only going to get worse.
But what happened? How did that change? I mean, I get the feeling that there used to be a higher perspective to media and to news. You used to have newsmen who would actually take a certain degree of risk in regards to doing their job because they believe in the higher narrative of getting information across to the public that had some level of objective rationality to it, even though, you can't necessarily hit it exactly on the head. Why did that change? What was the thing that propagated that particular change? Or is it still just the basic natural incentive of maximizing profit? You have about 30 seconds.
News has always been a business, but it's always been very careful and unabashed in its attempt to stay within the parameters of being transparent and telling the truth. There was a time when salespeople were not allowed in the newsroom, and many of them got punched in the nose when they walked there. Today, salespeople run news departments, and that's the difference.
We're listening to Rick Sanchez, internationally recognized, award-winning broadcaster, journalist, reporter, news presenter, and host of the nightly news show, Night with Rick Sanchez on RT America. Rick, thank you for joining us. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
In the independent corner, out on the West Coast at this point, weirdly enough, I am your investigative radio show host, Shane Stranahan.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to some headlines. In the news, DC's own football team, the Washington Redskins, will finally be changing its racist name today. Sports Business Journal was the first to report the announcement plans, which were later confirmed by the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. Now, despite the announcement, the new name will not be revealed today because the team's preferred replacement is involved in a trademark dispute. Epstein's longtime girlfriend and fellow alleged pedophile Ghislaine Maxwell is reportedly being moved from cell to cell to lower the chances of an assassination. A rather fascinating event is occurring in Ghislaine Maxwell's trial while this takes place. A prong of her legal fence seems to hinge on the sweetheart deal that Epstein got with Acosta. That deal found Epstein accepting 13 months in exchange for protecting any associate that was engaged in his salacious illegalities of the 30 girls he was caught abusing. And asserting she was one of the associations, it asserts legal protections from the prosecution afforded in that deal. We're going to discuss that a little bit later because that's mind-blowing. Luis Elizondo, the man that ran the U.S. government's Aerospace Threat Detection Identification Program, was set up to investigate UFOs, who said the Pentagon has a quote-unquote lot more highly classified videos of so-called unidentified area phenomena. In April this year, the Department of Defense published the declassified videos online, which had been leaked in 2017 and 2018 by the New York Times and a company co-founded by Blink-182 singer Tom DeLonge, called To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences that researches UFO phenomena. That is a weird story that we have to tell someday, because at this point the U.S. military now has a contract with that same organization to investigate UFOs. It's fascinating. President Donald Trump commuted Roger Stone's sentence on 7 felony crimes on Friday. Former special counsel Robert Mueller criticized the decision, saying that Stone, quote-unquote, remains a convicted felon, and rightly so. We'll be talking about Roger Stone's case and commutation with Tyler Nixon at 8:30 today, just in a few minutes. Trump has worn a mask for the first time during a pandemic in a highly publicized visit to Walter Reed National Medical Facility in suburban Washington to meet wounded service members and healthcare professionals caring for COVID-19 patients. Hooray! The president has on a mask. Hooray! Florida has seen a total of more than 15,000 new coronavirus cases in a single day as Disney World's parks begin to reopen this Saturday. This comes as the state has seen 45 deaths in the last day and around 70 on average. A federal appeals court has ruled the first federal execution in 17 years may proceed as scheduled today. Family members and victims of Daniel Lewis Lees may take their case to the Supreme Court, as the family has mentioned it would not want to contract coronavirus while attending the execution. Wow, that's grim. In Poland, Andrzej Duda has won his second term as the Polish president with a narrow 3% lead. Poland's governing right-wing Law and Justice Party, which Duda is closely allied, will continue its controversial judicial reforms. The Navy has said 21 people were injured in an explosion and a fire on board a naval ship in San Diego, which continues to burn now as firefighters stand by and watch. Those 21 people include 17 members of the Navy as well as 4 members of the general public. It's unclear what caused the explosion, but initial reports indicated overpressurization as a compartment started heating up. The ship holds about 1 million gallons of fuel. And last, actor Johnny Depp will be giving his last comments in the Amber Heard libel trial today. After a series of high-profile spats over the details of the crumbling divorce, the latest news in the Heard or one of her associates may have defecated in Depp's bed, which he said was the last straw in their failing relationship. I don't blame him. That is the news, or those are the headlines. You're listening to Thomas and Stranahan. This is Fault Lines. Yeah, that's a rough one, man. That's a tough one. That's always a tough story to follow, right? Because whatever comes behind that can never really live up to just the grossness of that story.
Did you just say whatever comes behind that? Oh man, Jamarl.
Right. Right.
Come on.
No pun intended, by the way. No pun intended.
Exactly. There you go.
But that's how horrible that is. That's horrible. And he says, that's the last straw. I'm just not going to take that anymore, buddy. Wow. That's a hard act to follow. But I think I can beat that act. So, as you know, Ghislaine Maxwell, I want to talk about this because this is fascinating to me. And we have time. Good. So, Ghislaine Maxwell is captured. She's basically caught. And many of the charges stemmed from, let's say, associations with Epstein and the trafficking of women and so forth. Now, Epstein supposedly either committed suicide or was suicided in his prison cell with a litany of oddities where, you know, people have a hard time explaining and just kind of chalk like 20 things up to coincidence. In this very specific case, though, the federal government is saying we are going to deliver Ghislaine Maxwell to the case. And so we've been shuffling her around, we've been giving her paper clothing, and we've been stripping away anything that she could use to potentially off herself. Great. Now, Ghislaine Maxwell has started to put on a vigorous defense. And part of her defense is basically making the argument that the case with Epstein in 2007 with Acosta, where Acosta gave Epstein 13 months, and if you remember, it also shielded his associates, meaning anybody who Epstein was working with during the time, was shielded based on what Acosta allowed in that ruling. Now, Acosta didn't initially tell the kids or the people that were abused in that ruling that was supposedly illegal. Initially, a judge says that's illegal. An appellate court just recently said that is not illegal, meaning that regardless of what that deal was and how gross that deal was, that deal that he made is still legally binding. And because that deal is potentially legally binding, this is what she is trying to use. Now, whether that works or not is a secondary factor. And fact of the matter is, just because it may try to use this for federal charges doesn't necessarily mean that she won't be held up on issues of state charges. But just right here, the governor's case is subject to a significant challenge. In evaluating the strength of the government's case, we note that Mrs. Maxwell intends to mount several legal challenges of the indictment, including, 1, the prosecution is barred by Epstein's 2007 non-prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice, which covers any potential co-conspirators of Epstein. Now, by definition almost, this to some degree is some level of a tacit admission that I was a potential co-conspirator, but I don't want to necessarily say that outright, so I would just allude to that fact that I am covered under that premise. Now that I found to be mind-blowing. Now Shane, you have more information on this, so I'm going to let you explain if anything that I said that was wrong. Now, everything that I said was right in regards to what she's trying to do. But whether or not this will work or not, you have a point of view on this. What do you have to say about it?
Well, here's the only thing I would have to say real quick, and I'm trying to get the exact article. But the key thing to understand about the Acosta plea deal, the 13-month deal that you're talking about, is that he has said that he got a call from his higher ups that significantly changed the way that he handled the case. And I wanted to go back to that article so I could get the exact verbiage to report it on the air here. So still getting that.
I thought he said it was above his pay grade or something, right?
Exactly.
He said it was like above his pay grade.
It was from people above him, exactly, handing down advice, and it was sort of override his default way of approaching the story. Therefore, you know what I mean? If you get a call from the higher ups, if it changes how you're handling it, then they have the power to pressure you, either softly or a little bit more hardly, to try to do what they want. And that's, of course, what we can all assume happened here, I think, pretty safely. But I'm trying to get the specifics on that because I think that's, again, a window into the weird and dark and shadowy space that's the really important substance of the Epstein story. Why did he get that call? You know what I mean? That's the real question there. Who did he get it from? What were the contents of that call? That whole cluster of issues. If we could have the answers to those questions, that would probably go a long way towards explaining the existence and the practices of whatever networks seem to have been in place to protect Epstein and possibly many others.
It's utterly fascinating, though, when you really think about it. I mean, what they basically allowed them to do was to say that, yes, we accept that there are other people who work with Epstein in doing this. We accept it. On top of accepting it, we are still going to give immunity to those people either way. Now, it's not named in regards to who Epstein was working with, but regardless of whether they're named or not, just the notion that you're going to give such a broad defense of this stuff in this way. And, you know, like Acosta apparently could have let the states handle it, but when you talk to the states, they say Acosta came in and put in this kind of overriding deal. Yeah, it's just a fascinating idea that these guys are going to use this, which means she's basically going to assert, yes, I'm guilty in the sense that I was working with Epstein. By the same token, I am legally protected in my guilt. That's mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing, and if you look at it plainly, it's just ridiculous. Why would it make any sense if you're representing the government, if you're trying to investigate real crimes? Why would you cut yourself off when the crime is so heinous? From learning about what actually happened, from charging other people who were involved, that whole set of issues. It's as far as I can tell, it's purely to provide protection. And again, it was a couple of years ago at this point. It was over a decade ago. So again, maybe the timeliness isn't there, and so people aren't thinking about it in those terms. But just coming back to it, it is heinous that that's what happened. One of the worst crimes you can imagine a person committing, and then protecting an unnamed and unknown number of other people from facing the music when it comes to dealing with a crime, let alone we're talking about charging them, just even figuring out what was actually going on. If you can't charge those people, then there's not nearly as much cause to investigate them. And if you're not going to investigate them, then you're not going to be able to actually get to the core of what was going on. Possibility that continued, which seems very likely. That whole issue, it's just astounding to me that we sort of accepted that was even reasonable to do in the first place.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when Acosta made that plea deal, the probes that were ongoing, that the FBI was dealing with, were basically shut down. This is Miami Herald. It says not only will Epstein serve just 13 months in county jail, but the deal, called a non-prosecution agreement, essentially shut down an ongoing FBI probe onto whether or not there were more victims and other more powerful people who took part in Epstein's sex crimes, according to the Miami Herald examination of thousands of emails, court documents, and FBI records. The pact requires Epstein to plead guilty to 2 prostitution charges in state court. Epstein and 4 of his accomplices named in the agreement received immunity from all federal criminal charges. But even more unusual, the deal included wording that granted immunity to any potential co-conspirators who were involved in the Epstein crimes. The accomplices or participants who were not identified in the agreement, leaving it open to interpretation on whether it's possible to refer to other influential people who were having sex with underage girls at Epstein's various homes and on his plane. My mom said she never wanted me to become a lawyer, and it's for stuff like this. Because it is your job to find a way of getting this woman off. And if that means asserting that a deal that Epstein should have never received is enough to do so, then your job demands that you do just that. And these lawyers are going to get their paychecks by us basically asserting in court that in fact that she may be guilty, that means that she is basically innocent because you can't charge her. Wow. Like, how weird is that? That is so utterly bizarre. And yet,
I'll be honest, man. I kind of wish your mom had encouraged you to become a lawyer, just because you'd make the courtroom a lot more interesting and fun and honest too. Not to mention that.
I don't know.
Regardless,
I mean, yeah, I don't know.
Maybe we can go into a break. We can keep talking. If you want Jamarl to become a lawyer and revolutionize our judicial system, please call in. The number is 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. We will be back in a minute to talk about Epstein, other stuff too, I'm sure. Anyway, back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. We are coming out of DC live. You can hear us on the radio at 105.5 FM, 1390 AM, and in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We've been discussing media. We've been discussing Epstein. I want to shift slightly to a conversation that people are having around the COVID-19 thing. Now, Donald Trump, for the first time, apparently, was caught wearing a mask, and this became somewhat of an issue, getting across the oddity of a health issue being politicized to the point of basically the fact that the president has worn a mask. This is somewhat of a shocking thing. Well, the president is finally acknowledging that reality asserts itself. The other point to this I also want to hit on is the death penalty for 17 years, the first time that there's going to be a federal death penalty. If you look back in the old days, and this is not going to necessarily be something that Democrats are all that on board with now because of obvious reasons that Trump wants it, but in the old days, if you look back, what you would see is Joe Biden looking into the camera, standing in the well of Congress, screaming that Ronald Reagan was not killing enough people with executions by the federal government, saying, "We've given you this power and you're not using it," chiding the president to basically be more hawkish in regards to killing Americans. Even going so far as to say, "I don't care about your upbringing. I don't care how you came out to be or what your world was like. We need to do something about this." And these were some of the powers. Now, this is going to be the first killing that has taken place in 17 years. If we were able to get by for 17 years, why do we need to restart? And is this being done entirely for Donald Trump's law and order and that frame of ideological reasoning that is going to be used to basically put this man to death? Or is there an actual need for the mechanisms of the state to end this person's life? What do you think about that, Shane? Because I think there's a fair question to ask. Should the state do things like this? And it's entirely a political choice or a political opinion that doesn't entirely have a right or wrong answer unless you're going to have right or wrong tethered to some kind of goalpost. Where do you fall on this? And how do you think about this?
I'm also opposed to the death penalty in practically every case. I'd need to think about it more because you don't want to finally decide on these things. But like you, I think there's a legitimate conversation to be had. You know what I mean? It's one of those issues. Yeah. It has to do with the fundamental definition of the state and the relationship that the state has with its public. And so that's one of those real deep questions. And this is right at the core of that question. Does the state have the right to end a person's life? That is about as close as you can get to the core of that question. So there are different answers to that, and those answers are going to dramatically change how you view the state, how you view its relationship with people, all that stuff. But for me, it's like, no. I lean towards no. It probably shouldn't be able to do that. And this also touches on this whole question of not necessarily criminal justice reform necessarily per se, but just our justice system in general. Ideas about carceral justice and comparison between that and restorative justice. That's a whole conversation. That's the kind of thing that fits into this conversation a bit. There's also this pragmatic perspective where you can look at, for instance, rates of recidivism in different populations. But there's also my broad take on this. The death penalty is a sort of hot button issue, and it's an important issue. But there's also an incredibly deep conversation that we could be having when it comes to institutional design, figuring out not just what's right to do, but what actually works at reforming people. That's a whole other can of worms. That kind of segued out of that. What's your take, Jamarl?
No, that's a really interesting can of worms. It's a good one though, because if you think about it from the standpoint of your political leaders, they deal with their incentives, right? They take a certain action because incentives push them a particular way, or their ideology is going against the tide in regards to incentives. But most of these guys, if you put, 1,000 politicians down a rabbit hole, most of them come out in a particular way, then that means that the incentives are driving those people's behavior in a particular direction. Well, one of those is being tough on crime. I mean, part of the reason that Democrats ended up in the way that they ended up was because they didn't want to be called wimps by the Republican Party, who were tough on crime. So Democrats became that much more hawkish, either from a foreign policy standpoint and in the context of criminal justice. But this ignores the societal impact on people. Meaning, you could have all sorts of research to get to the root of what makes a person better. How do we avoid people ending up in these situations where we have 25% of the world's people that are in prison in our jails? What are we doing wrong as a society that is creating and propagating this issue? We don't do that. That's more nuanced. That's more thought fulfilled. That's more, let's deal with the material situations people find themselves. That comes across as weak. And because that comes across as weak, that is a far more difficult conversation for people to have. And so you get just more and more money dumped into the cops, with politicians having every incentive in the world to continue to remain and look tough. And so, but like you said, the more nuanced conversation is the one that's more interesting. Can we be doing things to make people better? And look, I am against the death penalty, providing it's not anybody in my family. And I think a lot of people feel that way. That basically, no, I don't necessarily want the state having this mechanism where it can kill and murder citizenry, especially if I know that dispensation of force is not necessarily used in a way where we can ensure that the person who's being killed is indeed the person. And there are plenty of cases where you find out that they got the wrong guy, or that they were incentivized to get somebody on the hook, and so the person who they found up and end up on the hook wasn't indeed the person who committed the actual crime. And so I have qualms with this. And so I agree with you on this, Shane. And, we've made it with 17 years. What is the thing that is paining us to such a degree? Well, all of a sudden we need to go back to doing this. It just seems like Donald Trump wants to make a point. And trying to make his point, criminal justice, the most blunt end of the state's powers, basically death. So yeah, I feel you on that, and I agree with you.
Well, one quick
that
note
issue.
on this specific story too. The guy who's facing potentially execution today, again, we'll see if this gets pushed back a bit, but he's facing it. He was a white nationalist in the Pacific Northwest who was basically pushing for an ethno-state and killed, I think it was 3 people. So just sort of putting that story in context, it is interesting at this moment in history with the Black Lives Matter movement. It sort of doesn't need to be said. Executed is a white nationalist, and so I think it's easy to push back against Trump because this is happening under his presidency, but it's also it doesn't support the racist narrative. In other words, there's plenty else you can say in terms of things that Trump has said that you could label racism, but this specifically is just this interesting thing, especially when the conversation around the criminal justice system, around our jail system, and the demographics of who gets arrested disproportionately, who gets targeted, that whole conversation. It's interesting that the person who's being executed is being executed for committing hate crimes.
Yeah, in this particular case, it's not into race. Look, I try to tell people when I think we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about the criminal justice thing entirely through the context of race, especially if it's in the context of Black Lives Matter with the argument of defund the police. And I think part of the problem with that is, the majority of the people in this country are white. And you might get 1,000 people being killed by cops over a year, and you may have a disproportionate number that may be black, but the majority, overwhelmingly so, are white. This is an issue that affects all of us. It's not necessarily an individually issue pertaining to race, even though that the lens that we've been talking about this has been within those racial lines. I still feel, look, we are doing something as a society to produce that guy. Whatever you want to think about individual choice and everything else, that stuff is a myth. Ultimately, we are born into a system in a society where our understanding of what's right and what's wrong are sometimes understood in a different way than which society is telling us, especially when that doesn't necessarily line up with the world to which you find yourself. And whatever that kernel of you that's being propagated in our world that kernel of you that's you is still engaging with a society that is giving you certain feedback and certain cues that is either making certain aspects of you flower and others die, and vice versa. And sometimes those things are to the positive or to the detriment of the society itself. We are doing something to produce our monsters. And until our society reconciles that, and I make the argument, all crime is rational. And I say that because if it's a cost-benefit analysis, a ratio between either something that you want to accomplish versus how you think you're going to get caught, or whether you think you're going to be prosecuted, and whether you're even willing to accept the consequences of being prosecuted in comparison to what you want to actually acquire, it becomes somewhat of a rational act. Now, in this gentleman's case, the guy's racist, and he's committed a crime based on a racist intent. But again, if this man was on Vulcan, would he have come out to be that way? Maybe he would have had propensities to it, yes, but would he have come out this way? Probably not. It is something that we're doing that is creating this type of stuff. And our criminal justice system never looks at it from that angle. It boils everything down to individual choices if people have individual determining bodies in this process and not necessarily pushed by various whims of incentives. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by that. And I think we missed the boat. This gets to what you say, Shane. You know, we need to have a society that basically tries to figure out what nurtures, or for that matter, diminishes criminal behavior. And that's not something we do. We just prosecute.
It's true. You know what I see coming in right now? There's a lot more we could talk about with this issue, but we also have a caller, Rod from Philly. Rod, I see you on the line. What is on your mind?
Hey, what's going on, guys? Yeah, you know, I was just listening on the conversation, and we started trending towards crime, and you know what incentivizes people to do crime, and it's a touchy subject. You know, I'm from North Philly. Before that, I'm from Queens, New York, Jamaica, Queens, New York. So those are two places that I know very well. And a lot of times, you know, it's not necessarily. You know, I know a lot of people attribute to poverty. I'm born with poverty. You know, I'm not ashamed of that. There is a lot of violence when you're in an impoverished neighborhood. But what's happened in the last 20 years or so, kind of almost, in a sense, surpassed poverty, because now the crime is the new trend. And I'm not just saying just crime in general, but I'm talking about being violent. You see a lot of young people now that just anything that gets on their nerves or gets them emotionally active or rage, they just want to be violent. They don't want to talk it out, or if they talk it out on the internet, they just want to be violent. You see violence towards women from young men, or men in general. You see violence, you know, from young women against young women because you know, someone's dating this one, that one, third. So it's not necessarily just the poverty. It's more than that. It's way more than that. And it's not something you can just sit down and talk to these people about, because they're so entangled in it. But believe me, I live in it. I see it all the time, especially in the younger generation. They almost live in this state of I want to be violent. It's a trend, and it's coming out in line, and music, movies, et cetera, and a lot of young people, they want to live in it because it's trendy. It's trendy to be violent.
Thank you for the call, Rod.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Go ahead, Jamarl. Yeah, something I wanted to say too, but yeah, go for it.
Yeah, go ahead. No, make your comment.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Violence is one of these issues where it's really foundational, and it's hard for us to talk about it. I mean, our culture, at least sort of in countering your point just now, I'm going to sort of present what I see as the status quo. Our culture thinks for the most part, we've gotten over violence. We sort of moved past violence. Has to do with a lot of the whole liberal democratic thing and the idea of peacefully working things out with each other. And so in a weird way, this is one of our blind spots, because historically, violence is one of the most foundational aspects, not of human nature, but just of biological nature in general. You know, it's force, and politics in some ways is, you know, an extension of force. It's an attempt to contain it. There's this statement, this phrase, the state contains violence, and it works with both definitions of the word contains. The state contains violence, and the state contains violence. I don't know if that came across, but if it did, you got it. It both creates violence, of course, but with the the express purpose of diminishing violence. And ultimately, when it comes to violence in culture, a lot of that, I think, has to do with the role of the state and how well the state is doing at containing violence. And there are all these different sides of this. It's a really interesting conversation. I didn't mean to derail it too much, but just sort of pinging on that, maybe something we can come back to later. I think we should go into a break right now, though, because on the other side of this break, we're very happily going to be speaking with Tyler P. Nixon, archivist, activist, technologist. We'll get back to that in a second. We're going to be talking about Roger Stone, the Trump commutation, the Trump commuting his sentence. We're also going to be talking about the history of that case, different aspects of this, how it ties into deep state shenanigans. Regardless, though, we will be back with Tyler Nixon in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We happily are inviting, and glad to know that our invitation was accepted, Tyler Nixon to join us right now. He is an archivist, activist, technologist, legal counsel to Roger Stone. That will be the especially pressing aspect of this conversation. Regardless, though, if you want to follow Tyler on Twitter, you can. Real Tyler Nixon. That's RealTylerNixon, just like Nixon, like that. All one word, no spaces, nothing funny there. Anyway, Tyler, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Congratulations on the show. I've just been listening in. It's excellent. You guys are doing a great job.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you. We try to have interesting conversations. Still kind of new to it, but really taking it off. Yeah, and there was a big changeover. This stuff, we can talk about it more off air, but yeah, it was bittersweet. Lee and Garland, the thing blew up. It had kind of been building up, but it seems like they're each doing pretty well. So anyway, we brought you on today to talk about Roger Stone. So Trump on Friday commuted his sentence. There's a lot more to talk about. We were talking earlier about the charges again. Dog. We briefly mentioned what happened with Steve Bannon and how Bannon apparently had given conflicting testimony before Congress and then on another occasion. A lot of stuff to get into here, but maybe we can start with what happened on Friday. What was the chain of events that led to Roger, and how does Roger seem to be doing after this stuff has gone down?
Well, first of all, just real quick, I've known Joe Biden for 36 years. I'm from Delaware. I'm in Delaware right now. I grew up with Bo and Hunter, went to school with both of them, went to church with Bidens every Sunday. I've known this man for many years, and if he gets elected, this country is in really, really bad shape. But we can get into that. We can get into that more if you want. I've been following this, known him personally, and went to his school, his high school, Archmere Academy. Like I said, with his classmates or schoolmates with Bo and Hunter. But as far as Roger goes, of course, Roger is exhausted after being on the edge of his seat for, upwards of I guess about close to 6 months now. And the chain of events were, the president, I guess, his hand was to some extent forced by the fact that they were going to force Roger into a federal prison in Jessup, Georgia, as of tomorrow, and which was just an untenable situation. I mean, he's almost 68 years old. He'll be 68 in about a month and a half. And, he's got his wife, Nydia, is, dependent on him. She's hearing impaired to the point of being almost deaf. And it was just a sadistic, in my opinion, sentence overall, considering just the fact of the supposed crimes that he committed which were mere utterances to Adam Schiff and his ilk and the Intelligence Committee in a totally contrived case that was it's having seen it from the inside, knowing the material as well as I have for the last roughly almost coming up on 3 years, I was shocked and appalled at just what was the extent that these prosecutors would go in literally just trying to get this man. I mean, first of all, the fact of 4 federal prosecutors assigned to a case involving process crimes for one man itself was an indication that they were really out to get this man, really out to railroad him and make a political target of him. And just their actions within the case and before the case, the shenanigans that went on, and then the secrecy involved, the judge sealing everything, constantly having sealed. I don't understand why anything was sealed in the case. Public trial. You're not talking about national security secrets or anything that's super ultra confidential or classified, yet the public was denied often critical information just on the notion that this judge would just arbitrarily decide to seal matters, and a lot of it still remains sealed. So I think the president had been alluding to it. He had watched enough about the case. He had also seen the fact of the jury taint involved, the stacking of the jury, completely against. It shocked me the extent to which they went to really rig this case. Just the fact of getting this judge alone was a rigging. There are, I believe, 13 judges on the U.S. District Court in D.C. They filed a notice of related case trying to tie Stone to the sort of phantom prosecution, I guess you could call it, indictment that was filed against 12 Russian agents, supposedly. On the thinnest of, I've yet to see any hard evidence whatsoever that establishes the so-called Russian, or the Russian agency involved in the dissemination or the hacking or anything involving the DNC, Clinton, or Podesta emails or any information whatsoever. It's completely just based on vague assessments issued by the so-called intelligence community. And that was the first 3 pages of the indictment. Yet Roger Stone was denied by the judge in granting a motion in limine, which is to exclude. Motion in limine is to exclude evidence, excluding any evidence whatsoever involving the Russian collusion charges, the Russian, anything related to that was excluded. So you're talking about the foundation of the case, from the fruit or the tree from which this supposed fruit was born. Roger Stone could not raise any issues of that whatsoever.
Tyler, but you're not trying. Two questions. You're not trying to say that Stone wasn't guilty of lying to Congress, are you? I mean, basically the plank that kills or puts a bullet in Russiagate is the lying conviction, because the conviction is basically that said that Roger Stone said that he had a backdoor connection and Roger Stone didn't have that connection. And on the secondary point about whether or not you're accepting Stone's guilt in this case, was Stone in communications with Donald Trump before this commutation took place?
No, not at all. He hadn't spoken to the president in over 2 years, I think it was. No communication whatsoever. But even with people in the White House, it was completely, nothing. I mean, his dismay, obviously, because he had no idea what was going on, he believed he was going to have to report to prison. So it was, he prayed for it, he hoped for it, but it was definitely a shock in terms of what the president actually doing it and following through on it, because a lot of people said he just wasn't going to do it. But he had obviously alluded to it. And there were people I knew who, knew people within the coterie around the president who said, there were strong objections to it. They didn't want the president to do it. They didn't care about Stone. A lot of them had personal animus against Stone. So I think Trump actually had to buck his own people, including his attorney general, in order to do this. But Roger had no idea. I mean, there was just never an inkling as to what was going to happen. And that was the first he had talked to the
president, I believe, since probably around May of 2017. I think it was the last time, sometime in that mid 17. So, well, actually, no, 3 years ago, I guess it would be, since he last spoke to the president.
What about the?
That's interesting. You know, and actually,
go ahead,
yeah, go back. Jamarl, go ahead.
No,
Jamarl,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's just the first one. So this is something I've been trying to get some light on, and this would tie in, I believe, with Steve Bannon, former CEO of Breitbart News, of course, also the temporary campaign manager for Trump's campaign. When a lot of this stuff was going down after Paul Manafort dropped out, that's a kind of a whole nother bucket of worms, but maybe not exactly. But to Jamarl's first question, what exactly? Let's get back to the meat of the story. What exactly is the most egregious claim they're making about what Stone did here, and how are the courts getting it wrong? And then maybe the other perspective is, did he do something wrong in your opinion? If so, what was that? How's that being portrayed too?
I think he made misstatements to under intense questioning. Look, the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff and those folks insisted on behind closed doors, confidential, whatever you want to call it, closed door interviews. Now, the reason they do that, the reason they have those in the rules, it's considered executive session, is obviously to protect information being brought out from witnesses or whatever the case may be. They have rules that are very, very strict concerning you are, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, you swear a second oath on top of your oath of office as a congressman, that you will not disclose or cause to be disclosed any information received in executive session, period, end of story, full stop. Literally, Roger Stone had not left the Intelligence Committee's star chamber back there before Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell, and what's her name? Jackie Spire were on the air discussing and disclosing aspects of his testimony, which they continue to do for upwards of a year, increasingly so as they realized that nobody was going to stop them or hold them to account for their grotesque and serious violations of the Intelligence Committee rules. Now, the reason this is relevant is because hanging out there was Randy Credico, who was sweating out the notion that he was the person who had some sort of connection in reality to Assange, WikiLeaks. And I guess he thought for a while they were going to target him at the outset of Stone's testifying, and then they were coming after him. Credico called this a witch hunt. He said it's just a fishing expedition, and Adam Schiff and his people are terrible, despicable, whatever. Mueller's a sham. Now, after they began disclosing that they were interested, that Stone, they think there was, lies, that he lied to the Intelligence Committee, all this stuff. If you have a witness who, such as Credico, or someone who's involved, has been named as the intermediary, listening and wondering if he's going to be held to account somehow or prosecuted for being connected to Assange, as soon as he hears that they're not interested in him, that Roger Stone they're after, then he can feel comfortable to basically do whatever it takes to, make sure that he's not going to be prosecuted or is not in their target sites, so he can become a cooperating so-called witness, whatever the case, which is exactly what happened. Within months of this going down, Credico was in the arms of Adam Schiff and the Intelligence Committee and the special counsel. So, you have the violations of the Intelligence Committee rules by these Democrat members, brazen violations, which, really go to the nature of testimony in the Intelligence Committee, where people expect, if they're behind closed doors, confidential testimony, executive session testimony, which is, by the way, under the rules, treated as classified information. In fact, perhaps on even a higher level, because they talk about bringing in classified information, it will be treated, quote, as executive session material, meaning they cannot disclose or even cause to be disclosed or discussed any material such as that. Now, that affected, first of all, Randy Credico's willingness to come in and lie. And the perverse thing about this, and Credico's a separate issue. I'll address the other stuff real quick, but I just want to point out, Randy Credico led Roger Stone to believe, repeatedly, and the evidence is there in text messages and emails that he had information, somewhere from Assange. Now, he was very close to, admittedly, and I think even at one point living with one of Assange's lawyers. And he had a close relationship with this woman. She actually testified at the trial, and she was not too happy, obviously, about Credico running around saying this. Now, Credico later admitted that he was basically lying to Ryder.
Hey, Tyler, just real quick. I want to take us into a break here. We're going to have to come back. We'll continue this. But we're running up against our break here. Regardless, we are joined by Tyler P. Nixon. We're having a conversation about Roger Stone, who was recently commuted just on the other side of this past weekend. Regardless, we were talking with Tyler. We'll be back with him in a minute. He is an archivist, activist, technologist, legal counsel to Roger Stone. And in that capacity, we're not exactly having the interview with him in that capacity. But anyway, that is relevant information for you. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. We continue to be joined with Tyler P. Nixon, archivist, activist, technologist, and legal counsel to Roger Stone, Donald Trump's person who worked with Trump and whose sentence was recently commuted on Friday to the chagrin of the Democratic establishment. Tyler, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, regarding the question of Stone's guilt, you're invoking Credico a lot. So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're making the argument that Credico was lying about being a link between WikiLeaks and himself, and in lying about it, Roger Stone, basically, just so I'm understanding, it sounds like you're saying that Credico was lying about being a link between himself and Russia. That's what it sounds like.
I'm not making that assertion. Credico admitted it. He said it. He said it repeatedly. Yeah, I was bullshitting. Oh, excuse me. He was BSing Stone. He said that.
Okay.
He said it in interviews.
I understand.
You can find all
now, I do understand that he might have said that. He even said that there were exaggerations and everything else. I grant you that. But what does that have to do with Stone lying to Congress over it? Credico came forward and basically said, okay, yes, there wasn't a link between these things.
Okay, well, first of all, I understand. First of all, the most serious charge is the witness intimidation. Without the witness intimidation, the false statements was a joke and would probably not have stood because they just, they were really petty cherry picks of statements that Stone made under what I would consider withering, questioning. They kept pummeling him with these questions about, did you ever text him? Did you ever, who's your intermediary? Did you ever text this person? Did you ever have any communications by phone, by this, by that? And if you look at the context of the questions, things like by phone, he said, well, how did you communicate with him? He said, by phone. Well, did you text? And the thing is, they're saying he denied ever texting, but, or emailing. And he said, I communicated with him by phone. Well, Stone texts and emails on his phone. So, there's things like that. And first of all, there's that. But
I mean, I do get that, but do you accept that he did threaten Credico and his dog? I mean, Credico, I've spoken to Credico. Credico basically said that did happen.
Absolutely not. No. First of all, they didn't even expose the antagonism that came from Randy Credico. Randy Credico repeatedly threatened. First of all, Randy Credico threatened another witness who was one of two witnesses, myself being the other one, who heard Randy Credico admit that he had a connection to WikiLeaks and claiming he was, the intermediary. So he admitted this. Then when the heat got on, denied it and said, no, that was never any intermediary. Meaning he was going to make Stone into a liar. And that's why Stone got upset. It's like, whoa, hold on a second. You've been telling me you have this connection. In his own tweets, I mean, as early as June of 2016, Credico tweeted out Hillary's campaign is, going to be destroyed or something like that by Assange. So this is Credico claiming he never made any statement.
I grant you all that. I swear, I grant you all of it.
All right, and let me get to this dog issue, because this is another thing. Roger Stone, Randy Credico, for years, and this is the ingratitude that amazes me. Credico is destitute. He lived basically in couldn't get work, had lost jobs. His career had failed as a comedian. He was often living hand to mouth. Roger Stone, over the years, had given him work that basically kept him, allowed him to survive, really. Roger Stone is loves dogs and he's got all these little dogs and cats around his house. I mean, he's totally an animal
I understand.
lover.
He may be the greatest humanitarian ever.
Let me finish.
Well, no, let him finish.
Okay,
Jamarl, let him
okay,
finish.
go ahead.
Let me finish. Okay, so he emailed Randy Credico and said, the city's going to take that dog away from you because you're neglecting it. 24 hours later, he said, I'm going to take that dog away from you. There's nothing you can do about it. So he was literally saying, you're too poor to take care of this dog, and I'm going to take it away from you. I'm going to make sure that your dog is not, you're neglecting this animal. So, this is in the context of Credico constantly antagonizing, frankly, and I'm sure at the behest of his numerous lawyers who he admits to having, ACLU lawyers, was literally trying to bait Roger into making statements. So, you look at Credico's statements antagonizing Stone over the course of emails and texts through that time. He was trying to get Stone to say things that would sound incriminating. He was trying to piss him off, and he was trying to get him to make statements, to antagonize Stone, who has a temper. And these guys have known each other for 15 years. So this was a couple buddies, going back and forth. And, Lugo, who threatened a third-party witness, somebody he didn't even know, David Lugo, said, I'll put a hole in your head because you're going to testify to the fact that I said, admitted to you privately during some documentary they were making that, yeah, I'm the guy between WikiLeaks and Stone. So, Credico is a despicable individual. He has sold his hero, Julian Assange, down the river with his testimony, which, by the way, again, the sick part is they're trying to say that Stone wanted Credico to lie and cover up his lies. It's just the opposite. Stone wanted Credico to tell the truth that he had been telling Stone. Yes, I have information about WikiLeaks, or I have this, information I can confirm this or that. And when Credico said, no, I'm going to deny that, Stone said, whoa, hold on a second. What are you talking about? Well, if you're going to lie like that, then just don't say anything. So, it's not a crime to attempt to get somebody to tell the truth. Okay. And that's what Stone was doing. And they portray it as him trying to get Credico to lie. That's just sick. I mean, really, it is. Because Credico is demonstrably a liar. I mean, I could send you clips right now of him saying he was gaslighting Roger. He was, screwing him around. He was, leading him to believe this. And Stone stupidly relied on Credico. And then when the heat got on, Credico denies it. And they let them get away with this. They let Credico get away with this. They didn't call him out and say, wait a minute, weren't you telling him all along that you had reason and making statements in his emails and texts like, don't involve my name in it, leave my name out.
Tyler, I think one of the differences, though, if someone would point to a difference in it, is that when the heat was put on, Credico owned up to, yes, I lied about this. That's what I'm saying. I grant you. I mean, you basically have attacked Credico.
No, he didn't.
Relentlessly over the past X number of minutes. Now, Randy Credico has never been on this network, has never been on this show. I've met him maybe just for a few seconds, so I can't necessarily go into the character of the person that I don't necessarily know. But I would say, it just seems like there's a lot of emphasis on Credico here as opposed to what Stone might have potentially did. And that between the two, it seems that Stone did lie to Congress. I mean, I'm not against the commutation. Don't misunderstand me. That doesn't bother me one iota. But it does seem like there's a lot of blame here regarding other people, as opposed to Roger Stone accepting a certain degree of blame in and of himself for basically lying to Congress.
Stone has said he made misstatements. Okay, so the questions about which he was prosecuted were literally in the span of 2 minutes out of 4 hours of testimony. And they fired these compound questions at him. If you read the transcripts, like, they'll ask 4 things in one question, and Stone is responding, and he'll say yes or no. And, who knows what he's responding to specifically, or what's going on in his head as they're pummeling him with this. Did he admit, yeah, I made misstatements, but was he trying to deceive them or deny them access to whatever? I mean, and not to mention, what was so important about anything that Roger Stone had when they say, first of all, that Randy Credico was not an intermediary to WikiLeaks, according to his testimony, which was untruthful. But moreover, the prosecution lied throughout the trial, lied about the fact that Jerome Corsi was so-called the real intermediary. They knew for a fact that Jerome Corsi denied this under 30 hours of questioning or interrogation by Zelensky and them that was so intense that Corsi called it mind control, and that they were trying to break him down, basically, trying to get him to somehow admit that he had some connection to WikiLeaks, which he didn't. He denied it. There's never been a shred of evidence that he ever had any connection or ties or communications with Assange or WikiLeaks or anybody. Yet throughout the trial, in order to portray Stone as having lied to the committee, they claimed that, first of all, Credico wasn't the real intermediary, but Corsi was. And this is including in the sentencing memorandum. How do you get away with that? How do you get away with lying to the judge in the court based on no evidence whatsoever that's absolutely denied? And they didn't call Jerome Corsi either. And they know why they didn't call him, because he would have blasted the hell out of the prosecutors for literally trying to browbeat him into making admissions or lying, frankly, about whether he had any connection to WikiLeaks. So, this is your case. I mean, there comes a point where Roger Stone should have to admit anything. He's innocent until proven guilty. And all they did was contrive a bogus case against him, rigged up by Adam Schiff in collusion with Zelensky and the special counsel, admittedly, in violation of the House Intelligence Committee rules, which, it's not for Roger Stone to prove his innocence, frankly, and they have demonstrated nothing. I mean, the idea that Roger Stone would say, I have no communications mentioning Julian Assange, that's absurd. This man has thousands of emails from people that would mention Julian Assange. Why would he say that? I mean, it doesn't even make sense. So, he obviously didn't understand the question that was being asked, or something along with, he didn't understand what they were getting at. And I think he thought the whole thing was in the context of Russian involvement anyway. What does this have to do with Russia or with, the shuttling of information that was supposedly hacked from the DNC? And, we wanted to bring up the, yeah, I'm getting heated here because this is such a complex case that they've boiled down to cherry-picked lies to railroad this man, and for 3 years and 44 months in prison. I mean, it's grotesque. These people are criminals. They have abused the justice system to railroad someone for political reasons. I mean, these are people that these are the despicable tyrants that this country was founded to reject.
I agree with you there. Yeah, and I mean, we're going to have to close this out. We only have about a minute left, but I understand why you feel that level of emotion about this, and not just because you're so close to it, but again, because this is an especially egregious face of this larger, as we all know, this larger myth about Russiagate, again, pushing back against Donald Trump, the establishment sort of reeling and retaliating in this way. I can understand why you feel that strongly, but as I think Jamarl has seen, you also have the facts. So we can continue this conversation. I'd love to continue this conversation to get you back on. Thank you for joining us now. Really appreciate it, Tyler.
Sure, thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, and hopefully we can have you on again soon. Anyway, great, interesting conversation there. We have another great hour coming up. For anybody who wants to learn more about Tyler, to learn more about what Tyler does, you can follow him on Twitter, Real Tyler Nixon. That's REAL Tyler Nixon. You're listening to the most disruptive show in American radio. We'll be back for another hour. Again, though, if you don't know who you're listening to, I hope you'll find out in a second. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we are back live from just outside the capital of the divided states of America, although I'm on the West Coast at this point. More on that in a few minutes, maybe. In the independent corner, I am investigative radio show host Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with Shane Stranahan himself, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Man, thank you so much for continuing to include me. That really does warm my heart and hopefully the listeners' ears. Together, Jamarl Thomas and I are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Oh, and you know what time it is, Jamarl. It's time for the news. Let's get into it. In our first story today, DC's own football team, the Washington Redskins, will finally be changing its racist name today. Sports Business Journal was the first to report the announcement plans, which were later confirmed by the Washington. The new name will not be revealed today because the team's preferred replacement is apparently involved in a trademark dispute. In our next story, we were talking about this for a second earlier. Epstein's longtime girlfriend and fellow alleged pedophile, Ghislaine Maxwell, is reportedly being moved from cell to lower the chances of an assassination. We're talking about the irony of that, how weird it is that that's coming out in the news, what that means about the whole Epstein suiciding himself thing, or Epstein rather being suicided possibly. Again, though, more on that later. We were talking about that earlier. Maybe we can come back to that in a little bit. In our next story, I'll cover this one too. Jamarl threw this in there. I didn't get to it in the first hour. It's interesting. Luis Elizondo, the man that ran the U.S. government's aerospace threat identification program, which was set up to investigate UFOs, has said the Pentagon has, quote, a lot more, end quote, highly classified videos of so-called unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP. That's unidentified aerial phenomena there. Anyway, in April this year, the Department of Defense published the declassified videos online, which had been leaked in 2017 and 2018 by the New York Times, in a company co-founded by Blink-182 singer Tom DeLonge called To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences that researches UFO phenomena, which is, again, now working with the Pentagon, apparently. Jamarl knows more about this stuff than I do, but we can come back and talk about that at some other point, hopefully get some guests on it, too. In our next story, we were just talking about this with Tyler Nixon. President Trump has commuted Roger Stone's sentence on 7 felony crimes on Friday. Former special counsel Robert Mueller criticized the decision, saying that Stone, quote, remains a convicted felon, and rightly so, end quote. And again, if you want to listen to that, if you want to hear some details about the case, if you want to hear a sort of fracas that we got into, a very mild fracas with with Tyler Nixon, about Roger Stone, about the trial, about what actually happened, you can go back and listen to that again. That was at 8:30 Eastern. In our next headline, Trump has worn a mask in public for the first time during the pandemic. That came as he visited a highly publicized visit to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in suburban Washington. He was meeting wounded service members and healthcare professionals caring for COVID-19 patients while he was there. And again, this is the big headline, the big picture I've been seeing all over the news. And admittedly, it's a pretty striking picture. But it's more about what it says than what it shows, I think, that matters here. Again, why the hell did it take so long? That's my question. He should have worn the mask earlier. Anyway, going into our next story here, Florida has seen a total of more than 15,000 new coronavirus cases in a single day. That comes as this Saturday, a couple of Disney World's parks began to reopen. This also comes as the state has seen 45 deaths in the last day. Again, relatively low compared to what we're expecting. There's a big conversation there maybe we can have about the coronavirus cases, this whole testing situation, why we're seeing so many cases and so few deaths. A lot of different potential explanations there, but that's for after headlines possibly. In our next story here, a federal appeals court has ruled that the first federal execution in 17 years may proceed as scheduled today. Family members and victims of Daniel Lewis Lees may take their case to the Supreme Court, as the family has mentioned it would not want to contract coronavirus while attending the execution. Over in Poland, Andrzej Duda has won a second term as the Polish president. He did that with a narrow 3% lead. This also means Poland's governing right-wing Law and Justice Party, with which Duda is closely allied, will continue its controversial judicial reforms. In our second to last story today, the Navy has said 21 people were injured in an explosion and fire on board a naval ship in San Diego. That continues to burn, that fire does, now as firefighters stand by and watch. The 21 people that were injured included 17 members of the Navy, as well as 4 members of the general public. It's unclear what caused that explosion. Initial reports, however, indicated overpressurization of fuel as the compartment started heating up. The ship holds about 1 million gallons of fuel, so that's a lot of fuel you can imagine burning there. It would make sense it might go for multiple days. Anyway, our last story here, actor Johnny Depp will be giving his last comments in the Amber Heard libel trial today. This follows a very high-profile breakup, divorce. After a series of high-profile spats over the details of that divorce, the latest news coming out of the trial is that Heard or one of her associates, I don't even know what that means exactly, may have defecated in Johnny Depp's bed, which he said was the last straw in their failing relationship. And that would be the last straw. That would hopefully there would have been a lot of earlier straws that would have given you warnings that you didn't want to be in that. But again, okay, you know what? We've kind of been reporting one side of this. And he alleges this. She's denied it. Who knows? You know, it's really just one of those stories. I don't even know why. What is celebrity, man? Anyway, those are headlines. We are fault lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Man, I can't get that off my mind. Please get that off my mind.
That's a horrible story. Yeah, that's a horrible story. That really is. I couldn't imagine walking in. Oh, God, that's a disgusting story. But,
it is.
I mean, relationships, man. Relationships.
It's true. Yeah, man, I put that at the end of the headlines, and that's just always like, you don't know where to go exactly from that. It stains your mind. It stains it. Anyway.
No pun intended.
Man,
no pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Oh, God. Okay, so many places we could go. What do you want to talk about? We can talk about UFOs for a second, actually. Let's
do that. Yeah, so let's do that. So Luis Elizondo is the guy who's working with the ATIP program. Now, this gets really fascinating, to put it mildly. As you notice, Tom DeLonge was in the mix of that story. Tom DeLonge was a rock star with Blink-182, but Tom DeLonge had a fascination with UFOs. So, being a rock star with Blink-182, he made certain governmental contacts to try to get him on the inside, to get him read into the stuff that most of the public don't necessarily see and isn't necessarily exposed to. If you look back at the Podesta leaks with Hillary Clinton, Tom DeLonge is all the way through them, talking about UFOs. It is one of the most fascinating things. He talks to all sorts of astronauts and spooks, and he asks that various people that he needs to come forward in order to make this work. And he gets the spooks that are necessary to come forward and make the story work. Then the videos he gets his hand on, helped by Luis Elizondo, where beforehand the Pentagon was somewhat dicey in acknowledging that they even came from the Pentagon. And this has to be clear. Other governments have released their UFO files, but the United States has not. Congress has gotten to the point, based on the Navy saying this indeed took place. There were things in our skies that we didn't know what they were, based on the pilots that have started giving testimony, not just testimony from standpoint of the press, but they've been very clear in what they saw, what they were encountering. And this is not just one, this is several. The New York Times, the CNN, the Washington Post, etc., all of these news organizations covered the story. Now, the interesting part to this is that DeLonge is saying, look, there are more videos. Now, the Pentagon recently put out the 3 videos themselves to show that, yes, these videos are authentic. And people's head exploded, and I sat there with a certain degree of deep satisfaction that I was absolutely correct a year before these people have started even noticing the story, but also with a certain degree of bitterness that I was right about these people a year before they even saw the story. The thing is, Tom DeLonge, though, or this group, the Academy of the Stars, is also working with the Army based on this kind of mechanical sciences. You're looking at supplies or materials that have basically been extruded from potential UFOs and try to find applications and science here on our planet. And so there's a lot of weird and interesting tie-ins that are taking place with To the Stars Academy that, if the organization was bogus, would not be working with our military. And with Congress basically calling for congressional testimony regarding UFOs, this issue doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And it's probably going to gain that much more heat as we move forward. So it is a fascinating story of how DeLong got involved in this, how the WikiLeaks stuff shows it out, how Podesta, who has had a fascination with UFOs, saying at one point on Twitter that the greatest failure of his life is not being able to open the UFO books. Not on Twitter, I'm sorry. He said that at a press conference when he was discussing his terms. If I'm not mistaken, he was either in Clinton or Obama's administration. But it is utterly fascinating how a rock star gets utterly and entirely entwined with all of these videos and stuff coming out. And in 2020, they're saying they're going to be releasing materials. This is also in an association with stuff coming out showing research that the government was doing. Things like weird physics, antimatter, time physics, all of this just bizarre electrogravitic stuff that they were doing that would have fit very comfortably in Star Trek universe that basically the public didn't necessarily know anything about. So there are multiple articles like in Popular Mechanics and whatnot that tries to help people get up to speed on this. But the story, it gets far more bizarre than just this part. And the research that the government was doing gets into areas that gets more into like poltergeist activity to try to find whether or not there was a connection between UFO phenomena. It is strange, interesting, at this point, mainstream news, considering that Congress at this point is going to start looking into it. So that is the bare bones of what is taking place in the overt sense of the word of this is basically the stated legitimate position for people to take. This story came out of Newsweek. So this wasn't even something that was, some kind of boony magazine, deep in the well of the internet. These stories are just now, at this point, legitimate stories. And Luis Elizondo has been saying some incredible things. So, Shane, that's my bare bone spiel in regards to what is taking place in this area. It is an area of my own fascination. You guys, if you've ever followed my channel from the standpoint of Political Misfits, where we would do the Wednesday Revelation segment, or if you follow my own channel. This has been a fascination of mine, and I don't understand why it's not more of a fascination for other people. We are a ball hurling through space. That is literally what we are. The dramas that you engage in on a daily basis are often fictional in the way that you go about trying to make a stupid human trick for cash. The reality, we're a ball hurling through space. And in the same way that we visit our celestial neighbors, it never occurs to us that maybe there's something out there that doesn't look like us, that is not entirely like us, but at the same token has the ability to question its existence, matter, trying to understand itself. And in doing so, as time permits, get out, it actually does do that. Maybe dealing with physics in a way that we don't necessarily engage with physics. That gets poo-pooed to the side. And that seems to be one of the most fascinating questions ever. So I am fortunate and happy that I am living during a time frame where this issue has become legitimized. Now, Shane.
It is. Yeah. No.
Now you are.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Jamal. Go.
Well, I was going to say you have maybe a slightly different issue on this, or topic, or perspective on this, and I accept that because Bob was the same way, where he was like, I'm not entirely comfortable with this issue, but I never really argue for anything that I can't necessarily back up. And at this point, this is, like I said, mainstream media. So.
Yeah, no, and to be clear, I mean, here's my stance. We kind of talked about this off air, but it's like if it's not just hard for me to research, but hard for me to prove to people, I tend to prioritize looking into other stuff. But UFOs are such an interesting phenomena. It's important that we get to the bottom of it. And like you're saying, with this stuff coming to the light now, coming up to the surface, with the Pentagon of all the agencies working with this organization, working with To the Stars. Another thing that's worth noting, I think, briefly at least, To the Stars, one of the co-founders, of course, was Tom DeLonge. So also with two other people, though, the other two founders of the organization. One was Jim Semivin, former senior intelligence officer with the CIA. Also, Harold E. Puthoff is an American engineer, parapsychologist. So just like an interesting little coterie of people, cohort of folks who started this up. Another thing here, As far as I can see it, we're going to go into a break in just a second. As far as I can see it, though, there are three ways this thing could be going down. First up, it's basically what you said. There's some extraterrestrial sort of thing going on here, whether it's aliens or some other strange set of phenomena, probably aliens. That could be the case, and that's mind-blowing, obviously, in its own way. Two, it could be, like you were kind of hinting at earlier, maybe really high-tech research the government is doing, various governments are doing, and then for a variety of reasons they want to keep that stuff secret. Some very obvious reasons potentially, and then maybe some others that might not be so obvious. We just don't know about them. And then three, the government could just be trolling us. I don't. The third one there is probably not the most likely, but it's just as a whole, any one of those is huge. Any one of those seems like the kind of thing that everybody in the world, practically speaking, would be interested in learning more about. Even the third in its own weird way. Regardless, though, we will come back. We'll maybe continue this conversation. We're also going to be taking calls on the other side of this break. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Quick listening note, if you want to catch us on the airwaves, you can. We're in Washington, D.C. on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in the D.C. area. We're also in Kansas City. You can catch us 102.9 and 104.7 FM, also 1140 AM. Alternatively, if you're a neophile, you can find us online, Spreaker, Stitcher, YouTube. We're also on Periscope, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, all over the place, man. But yeah, we're also on Periscope. If you go over to Twitter, you can find us twitter.com/faultlinesradio. And right up top there, you should see a live Periscope feed that you can watch. Also on YouTube, you can either search out Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Jamarl Thomas's channel has a live video of him, I believe, although not of me. Sadly, we've got to get that stuff working, man. We've got to get video going at some point, at least while we're still out of the studio, That'd be cool.
I would love to. Yeah, I would love to. It becomes an issue of bandwidth, apparently.
It does, yeah. And then there's this whole question about how we do it, how we route it. I don't know. That's stuff to talk about later with Andre and you and I. I'm actually, I'll throw this out real quick. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We're going to be joined in a little over 10 minutes, just giving people the heads up, by Danny Sjursen. We're going to be talking about the Russian bounty story just disintegrating, evaporating as the weeks have gone by. Also, the question of whether Biden's foreign policy would be any better than Trump's. No, I don't think it would. But we'll get Danny's take. That's mine, though. Anyway, yeah, man, I'm on the West Coast. It was a couple days of travel. Now I've traveled, and I'm out here, and I don't know if you can hear it. I'm staying with some family, friends. Family who are friends and friends who are family. In the distant background, occasionally you might hear a cat, a diabetic cat, who really needs food and is just waiting the last 12 minutes before he gets fed. Heads up, though. That's going on. That's my little life right now. Very cute cat, though.
That's funny. When my wife and I were traveling, we were staying in a place in Czech Republic. It was just on the border of Poland. And I had to be there because they had a medical facility that was nearby where I can get treatments. So while we were in this little town that was like literally you could cross the border into Poland and not even notice that you've crossed the border, we had a cat who the person told us, look, just make sure you take care of the cat. The cat sits out there. The cat's never supposed to come in the house, but the cat gets fed and everything else daily. And it was the wildest thing in the world that this random cat would just come there every day and get food and go about his way somewhere else. He had his own separate life, but he would come and get food at that time every day. How weird.
Intersecting with human culture. I kind of love that kind of thing. I mean, it's cool when you see species getting together in different ways, but it's also just cool when you have this little, a little animal who's just found a way to fit itself into society. And then there's this sort of anonymous relationship they have with a whole bunch of people. You know what I mean? Maybe not anonymous, but that extended relationship.
Yeah. Those things are always interesting in a very odd way. We were never cat people. We grew up as dog people. My mom is deathly afraid of cats. Like, a kitten can be on the street and she would cross the street in utter terror to get away from it. I'm saying that literally. That's how terrified she was of cats. I have no idea why. That trigger point was just always there. So cats was never the thing that we necessarily had in the house or were engaged around. We were dog people. And as dog people, we, for the most part, always had dogs. My wife, we have two now. We have a rescue, Bo. Bo has a tendency to get ill because either he had cancer once and then turned around a year later and ate a bunch of gloves after the pandemic started. But, I've always wondered what's the thing within the context of those familiar relationships, even having kids. What's the point at all? I know there's a biological imperative to that stuff, but when you look at it in real terms, that stuff is just responsibility and is eat into your ability to basically your decision space, not to mention your cash, your economic reserves, your ability to kind of leverage what you want in our society.
Yeah, you're talking about pets, right?
Yeah.
Just the idea of having pets.
Yeah, talking about pets or kids, believe it or not. I mean, kids are the same idea. What I come to realize, though, is that there's something that goes beyond just the logic of the responsibility. That it's we as human beings have certain faculties that, yes, we can be competitive. I have played chess my entire life. I enjoy the competition. In fact, I need it to some degree to get off excess energy, whether that's debate or whether it's chess. But we also have the capacity for cooperation. And that's one of those capacities that is not all that much stimulated, meaning the feeling that you get for doing something entirely for somebody else. That good feeling of, oh man, I feel fulfilled in doing that. We don't function on that, even though it's there. We function on that other feeling of, here's cash, go do something grimy for that cash. I think dogs, or for that matter kids, get to the root of this kind of cooperative aspect of human nature, of saying, yeah, we can be nurturing and whatnot in order to create this better human being to be somewhat, hopefully, a better version of ourself. But that does come down a lot to personal care. And that goes beyond just this notion of your own rational needs, or for that matter, your own decision space. You don't have any kids, right, Shane?
I don't have any kids. I'd love to have kids at some point, but you got to find somebody you want to have them with, and you got to take some time to get to know them. And so far, I've just lived a weird enough life that hasn't happened. Traveling constantly, doing all sorts of things, but that's in the books. Also, a farm at some point. I mean, we might have talked about this a little bit, and this ties back into the pets. We got a caller, so I want to go to the caller. I was kind of a jaded jerk a little while back, and I was like thinking, okay, when I get a farm, that's when I should have pets. That's when it makes sense. And they're not going to be pets at that point. They're going to be like companions in this sort of productive capacity, this relationship that you're enacting with them in this little biological system we call farming or whatever, ranching, however it's going to look. And I was sort of like, I had this philosophical idea, which is if you're going to have animals around, you don't want them to just be dependent on you. You want to have some way in which you're dependent on them. You want to have like a working relationship with them, because that breeds a sort of mutual respect that I think we want to have with our pets. And that was my perspective. I was thinking about all this stuff for a while. And then when I was out in DC, again, I'm on the West Coast for a little bit. I was out in DC. We had a puppy around the house. I really got to liking Evie, and that totally transformed the way I see animals. And now it is a lot like what you were just saying. You're in this relationship with them. We really want that, as humans, as living beings in general, possibly, but just as humans, we want to be around other people. And it's amazing that we can have these like intra-specific ties, that we can have these ties across species. You have these deeper levels of communication to whatever extent you can, a lot of subtle communication. And in a way, it doesn't just open you up to other people. It opens up to yourself. You get to know yourself better. And in another way, it does actually really open you up to other life and life in general. You're able to interact with somebody with a little miniature person, with their own mind, their own body, their own ties, their own expectations and ways of doing things, and doing that without being able to use language that's mutually understood in the way that we're used to with humans. It weirdly opens you up to your own subtleties, your own sensitivities, and your own kind of intuition in a bunch of different ways. So anyway, that was my little ramble. I don't want to cut Daniel, though. Daniel from Texas, I see you on the line. You're on. What's on your mind?
Hi there. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I wanted to get into both. You guys have great guests, and I think you and Jamal should get together and interview these guests at length, because you guys would have such a great intellectual conversation. The second thing I wanted to get on about UFOs or anything in the paranormal, every time you get close, every time you're about to prove that it's real, something will happen to just discredit it, make you lose it. I think that Patient 17 documentary, I forgot the guy who wrote it, he lost the probe, the alien probe that was taken out of this guy. And that's where I'm going to leave you guys at.
Daniel, thank you, Thank you, Daniel, for the call. So I think there are 2 points. There have been people who basically have procedures done in order to pull things out of them. The whole idea of proving becomes somewhat difficult. Now, from the standpoint of proving in the sense of pulling out something from somebody, well, that gets dicey either way you look at it. But from the standpoint of the military thing, that becomes somewhat different. Meaning, if we have somebody who's flying our airline or our skies to protect us on 9/11, and that person come forward and say, yes, for 9 minutes or for 5 minutes, I watched this thing that outperformed my vehicle as if it was a matchbox. Those are different things. And there are different things, even in the context from the standpoint of what one considers to be a threat versus the other one that is more benign and less, I guess that gets less credibility. Meaning, if I need to make a case, the one that I use to make the case is the one that is overt, because those are the easiest things to stand on when I make the argument. The secondary argument of other items like this, less so, because there's no way for me to make any headway on whether it's true or whether it's not. So that's kind of the way I see that stuff. On the other point, I want to get to something that you said, Shane, this notion of almost themes. There's a line that I am enamored by for some reason called "The Warrior Becomes the Protector." Now, what this gets into this notion of themes, how this particular individual as a warrior basically had no necessarily reason for being other than whatever his own interests were, becoming a protector where he gets to define stance. He gets a fine, understood purpose in his existence, and it is to protect this particular person, this particular thing, whatever that thing of value that he is ascribed to. And in doing so, he becomes something fundamentally different in the way that he sees himself. I am enamored by this. There's an episode of Star Trek where, Discovery. Now, Discovery sucked. From the standpoint of Star Trek, Discovery was not the greatest of Star Trek episodes. I'm sorry. I know some people out there might like it, but I'm sorry. It was horrible. You had a captain being attacked within the first few minutes of the show that is unconscionable. Nobody in their right mind would believe that Riker, under any circumstances, would attack Jean-Luc Picard, or for that matter, Spock. Yes, Spock and Picard got in fights, but that was something different. This was ghastly. However, there's a scene in that is probably one of the most epic scenes in all of Star Trek, where Captain Pike, who we all know ended up in a wheelchair with these little buttons that go beep beep in order to get him from point A to point B, Pike has to go to a planet and get a crystal. This time crystal has this unique ability to show people issues pertaining to what is going to happen in time. However, it is not fixed, meaning as Pike goes down there, his history, his future is somewhat fluid. Pike touched the crystal and sees his history, his future, of being basically mangled and burnt to death into this creature that is sitting in this little chair. And Pike, in that moment, falls back in this pain of angst of like, oh man, I can't believe that this is my fate. And the way he stilled himself was, I am a Starfleet officer. Meaning, the idea that he was a man was exceeded by what he considered to be his duty and his job working in Starfleet. And even that particular thing that he had to bear as a man, he couldn't do it, but as an officer, he was commissioned to do so. I am fascinated by those themes. I'm sorry, that's my little rant on that stuff, on issues of identity, that I get fascinated by that my wife in no way is.
No, that's really interesting. I can see how that, and here's the thing. We got to go into a break in a second, but I'm going to sort of briefly summarize and then maybe open it up to further conversation later. It is very interesting. There's this aspect of just looking at humans, but looking at life itself or something like this. You're right. When we step into roles, when we assume this role, when we specifically define the sort of capacities that we have, when we do it in our own way, we're talking about the warrior becoming the protector, where the warrior is this sort of independent. There's nothing that they're there for. That's just their their nature is their characters to be more combative or aggressive or defensive or whatever the case may be. But then once they assume some relationship of responsibility with the universe, in the case in their instance of being a protector, it's like that defines their life for them. That gives them their life meaning. It takes the base substance of who they are, and it allows them to do something with that. There's a really interesting conversation to have there. And I know that from the way you're talking about it, it's not just interesting to have, but I can tell it's relevant to you. I'm curious to learn more about that later. Maybe we can get into it. Maybe we should go into a break now, though. We're going to be joined on the other side of this break by Danny Sjursen. Danny Sjursen over on Twitter at Skeptical Vet. You can check him out, retired U.S. Army officer. We'll be back with him in just a minute talking about Biden's foreign policy, if he has one of his own, as well as the Russian bounty story dissipating over the last couple of weeks. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. I am Shane Stranahan. The other voice you'll hear is Jamarl Thomas. But first, actually, maybe, Jamarl, say hi real quick. Just say something.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. Welcome to Fault Lines.
There we go. That's Jamarl Thomas's voice. I just wanted to get that out of the way. Thank you. All right. The big thing here, sort of why I did that, is the next voice coming up. It's not Jamarl. It's Danny Sjursen. Danny, great to have you back. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll give you the intro after we bring you in, but how are you doing this morning?
I'm great. I'm glad to be on, guys. How are you doing?
Good. Having a little bit of fun, maybe too much fun. For those who are listening who don't know, Danny Sjursen is a retired U.S. Army officer. He's also a former history instructor at West Point. I mentioned where you can follow him over on Twitter. That's Skeptical Vet, just one word, V-E-T at the end, Skeptical Vet. You can also check out his podcast, Fortress on a Hill. He links to it there over on Twitter. He co-hosts that podcast with fellow vet, Chris Henry Henriksen. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, so we're starting to talk about today, we mentioned this earlier too, this Russian bounty story. It's like a continuation of the Russiagate hoax, I'll just call it that, a hoax that there was some deep collusion between Trump and the Russian government that dramatically affected both 2016 and the course of the presidency. We can get into that maybe, but as a sort of recent resurgence of that narrative, we saw this Russian bounty story come out, and it was potentially a flash in the pan. It seems like this very brief event that had some limited impact, maybe on the narrative, but doesn't actually seem to have done much. It was an excuse for people to invite Bolton onto the radio, though. Can't give that one up. But what's your take? It does seem like this has dissipated. Why do you think it came out at that point in time, and what do you make of its going away since then?
Well, I published a column to the effect that blaming Russia is like the bottomless Kim Jong's Kool-Aid in the American media and political sphere. However, I try to be careful, especially depending on the network that I'm appearing on, et cetera. Look, let's start out by saying it is sensible to be skeptical of this story or of any mainstream media story that ends the following way, comma, intelligence says. Okay, that was the headline in the New York Times. Blah, 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 bounties, comma, intelligence says. That packs a lot of punch that we should be really doubtful about. So I am skeptical of the story, and I'm skeptical of the timing, which I'll get into. But I want to say this first off. If we assume the story is completely true, which is a big if, I still think the reporting has been abhorrent because it lacks historical context. It lacks relative contrast with America's behavior in the past, in the present. And I think that it just failed to question why we're in Afghanistan in the first place. Okay, so that's kind of like my
caveat to start. It could be true. If it is, the reporting's still been ridiculous and we're making too much of it. But the timing's important because I'm no Trump fan. I just got thrown out of his rally and 4 of my friends arrested at a direct action, anti-war, racist protest in Tulsa, right? So, like, I don't like Trump. He's a monster. He's my least favorite person when it comes to, like, character, probably in the world. But, and I'm including, like, Kim Jong-il, and I know he's dead. So anyway, but my point is the timing's tough because every time Trump has tried to, like, end a war or think about peace, yeah, he doesn't follow through, and yeah, he does it for his own ego. But when he tries, there's always something that seems to happen. And I'm not a conspiracy guy. I'm more of an Occam's razor guy. But, and I know I'm rambling here, but just give me a second. But when he mentioned in 2018 getting out of Syria, just mentioned it, it was, I think, 4 days later that there was a chemical attack. Okay? Assad may not be a chess player, but I don't think he's really that stupid strategically. But okay, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. But now we're getting a lot of reports from, the OCRW saying, well, maybe not. And then when we try to, pull troops out of Germany, this story comes up. And when we try to make peace, maybe not, with, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, suddenly we've got Bolton and Pompeo spiking the talks while they're there. And then suddenly we find out that, the dear leader in North Korea, fed his nuclear negotiator with an alligator or something. And I'm stealing from Lee Camp here a little bit. But then we find out he's alive and well. The timing is really interesting in terms of, if I was conspiratorially minded, I would think, man, maybe the military-industrial complex doesn't want any president, Democrat or Republican, to downsize a war and hurt their profits because there seems to be some very odd coincidences in the story. So that's a lot, but I hope it's helpful.
No, it is. And you made the point that a lot of the media attention lacks context. I don't think it's conspiratorial to point to multiple cases if the outcome ends up being the same thing over and over and over again. Meaning, as you pointed out, in Syria, there was a chemical weapons strike when Donald Trump said he was going to pull his troops out. Or in North Korea, the talks were being basically undermined at the exact same time that, again, Donald Trump was trying to make some kind of association with that country in regard to peace. And right now, Afghanistan, Donald Trump is trying to extricate the troops out with the deal. And Afghan intelligence, most likely, who is terrified of that government collapsing, is basically putting out a story for media to consume and basically run with. And so I don't think that's necessarily conspiratorial. I think that's just kind of flat fact. This is what has been happening. You made reference to the point of the stories not having context. What would be the proper context in which to view the story if the story was indeed true?
Well, I mean, first we'd have to go back in time and we'd have to say, let's keep in mind that the United States genuinely and truthfully and demonstrably did pay bounties to what has now become the Taliban in its latest or more recent form to kill, to wit, maybe 15,000 Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan, and we brag about it. We brag about it, that it was this great Cold War victory. Reagan rode an eagle with an Uzi and defeated the Russians, right? And then in the more recent context or contrast, I mean, what kind of sociopath country goes nuts about this bounty story? And if it's true, I don't like it. I don't like the idea of any other country, collecting scalps for bounty on American soldiers. I used to be one. I buried a number of mine. But it seems like you'd have to be a pretty obtuse country to scream about bounties, without mentioning the fact that this is the country that publicly and proudly, pursues a vigilante foreign policy to the extent of, AG Barr putting an actual bounty on the head of state of Venezuela and some generals and other politicians there, elected officials. I mean, they literally put a bounty and then they proudly publicly stated it. And then we're like, oh my God, bounties. And I read 30 stories and wrote 4 articles about how we just put a bounty on a head of state that we're not at war with. So, I mean, I think that would be some of the relevant context. And I just feel like there's a sickness. There's like a cult of exceptionalism, and it's diagnosable in the United States. And our media is really the mouthpiece and propaganda arm of the State Department, which is the mouthpiece and propaganda arm of the CIA. So it's all connected, isn't it?
I can see that. I'm actually curious too. I mean, you're a former West Point instructor. You're talking about the sort of corruption or this rot having to do with American exceptionalism, what that's done to our conception of ourself, what that's allowed us to do with that conception to a lot of other countries, a lot of millions of people in terms of the numbers of casualties there. Is there any time period? What are the sort of key stages just in trying to understand the history? This is a big question. So I don't mean to put too much on your shoulders here, but in terms of trying to understand what led us to that point, both recently and in the past, looking at the history, what would you point out as some of the key events, key transitions?
Oh, well, I'm always happy to expound on that. In 2021, I have a 750-page critical, history of the U.S. since Jamestown coming out, which really takes on the exceptionalism disease. I think the first, the start point is that America was blessed with some kind of amazing aspects from its founding, all of which, sort of in an inverted paradox have come back to ultimately bite us. And so what I mean is, the United States is one of those rare, but there are several, mostly English-speaking, settler colonial enterprises from the first, meaning displacement and genocide and actually settling new people in a place. And so these settler colonial enterprises, whether it's Rhodesia, Australia, Canada, or the United States, they tend to have like a messianic sort of fervor to them, right? They're not just out for the money like some of the more sort of resource-based colonies of the other empires. Like they are going to settle and make a new Jerusalem. And so that's the start point to sort of the exceptionalism. But then also it's like this perfect place in terms of like beautiful natural resources and protected by two oceans, no real threats to its north and south. So then what that does is it creates like a triumphalism, and especially in the Calvinist sort of like dissenter Protestant tradition, there's this sense that more success, right, even if it's just a gift from God or fate, is seen as proof of, the deity's favor. That makes sense? So in other words, we start out with this and then we find reasons to reinforce it. And so then that just kind of develops. And so as we expand westward and find more success, as we then go overseas to the Philippines, and then as we win World War II with almost zero effect on our homeland and very minimal casualties compared to, say, everyone else. I think we had about as many battle deaths as Romania, maybe less. Again, we have this triumphalism. So I think that what's the point? So I'll finish with this. Enterprises like the United States, and this really is an exceptional nation in a lot of ways, just in many of the wrong ways, is characterized by sort of a chauvinism and a triumphalism as it develops. And so there's something inherently sick about being a unipolar superpower at the end of the Cold War. There's something inherently sick with proudly using the phrase unipolar superpower or hegemon. And like I said in a number of articles, if a country says it's exceptional, proclaims itself exceptional, we call that patriotism. But if a person, if an individual referred to themselves as exceptional or characterized by exceptionalism, we diagnose that person with Messiah complex and have them, put in a hospital.
That's a good point. Because I want to dive into this thing of exceptionalism also. When we're looking at ourselves, and we're looking at ourselves in the context of the larger world, I think you're making the basic case that it's almost like somebody playing a game of Monopoly where you give them $2 million and they don't acknowledge that they were given the $2 million when they're going about the game, and any kind of winning or anything else is attributed to virtue of themselves, not necessarily the benefits that they were appropriated with in the beginning of however they started. So I appreciate that. I totally accept that. What allows it to propagate, though? Because it gets to the point where it influences the media itself in their lens, in the way they look at stories, meaning the stories that they cover versus the stories that they choose not to cover. How is this affected, per se? Is this something that is just basically propagated as a groupthink narrative when they're looking at the stories and saying, okay, we're not going to cover this, but we are going to cover that, especially when those things that they choose not to cover are the things that probably are some of the most pertinent things to understand, as you made the reference to. The way we could look at a story like this and completely ignore the context to which that story takes place. How did that start? And how did that get emboldened? Because that goes beyond just a messianic complex from the standpoint of the origins of a nation. That gets into this kind of state that is supposed to monitor and oversee a governmental infrastructure that has basically, utterly failed and is tasked to do that in any real material way where the public gets what it needs to know regarding information of government's actions. In fact, let's take that answer on the second side of this. We are joined by retired U.S. Army and former history instructor at West Point, Danny Sjursen. We'll be back in a moment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Hi, this is Max Kaiser. I'm host Stacey Herbert, and we're doubling down.
Yeah, we're doubling down on crazy. We're doubling down on our new show called Double Down on Sputnik. It's doubling down on absolute joyous radio nirvana. You will love it. You will want to listen to every single episode on Sputnik. Bye, y'all.
Fault Lines.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. My name is Thomas. We are joined by Danny Sjursen. He is a U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point. I guess I'm basically asking, what did we go wrong from the standpoint of media and the way the media regarded our wars? Or did we always have some kind of off skew in regards to U.S. actions around the world? Or for that matter, has that gotten worse over time?
Well, it has gotten worse. I just have to go back to something you said that made me actually laugh. Luckily, I was on mute. You mentioned, how the United States almost acts like a country that was like inherited $2 million and then acts like it was all based on virtue. I couldn't help but think, like, man, that sounds a lot like the origin story of our president. But no, it has gotten worse. And so what developed here is sort of the media as a part of sort of a perpetual exceptionalism motion machine, right? So you're right. That didn't just happen at Jamestown. That didn't just happen at Plymouth Rock. Over time, America's media became more corporatized, owned in fewer and fewer hands, more tribally linked to political parties, but of course, interestingly, the duopoly is such that the media, even if it pretends to be on blue team or red team, ends up actually kind of serving the same oligarchic interest. This develops slowly and then picks up a lot of speed again after World War II. In some ways, 1945 is like the key pivot point in American history. And oh, by the way, I have like this theory, and it's awful, and I don't like saying it, but I'm just convinced it's true, or increasingly persuaded so, that like World War II was the worst thing that ever happened to the United States. Like Nazism had to go, Imperial Japan may probably have had to go, but like being triumphant in that war ended up being like the worst thing for the United States because it really just like sent this exceptionalism and this messiness into hyperdrive. So my point though is...
Well, I think your issue is power. I mean, I think the issue is a distribution of power that is almost singularly within the camp of the United States. And as such, it gets this feeling that it can do whatever it wants. That's what it sounds like you're hitting on.
I just want to jump on this real quick, and I'll bring it back to you, Danny. I've heard this phrase, the long nap, I kind of like for the last 75 years, or like you're saying, Jamarl, once we got into that position of power, it eroded our sense of responsibility, our sense of commitment. Anything that we had there was going to be eroded.
What's going on? That's not it. Why can't I hear you?